Tonight the air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp soil, and the faint hum of distant insects drifts through the dark like a tired hymn. The year is somewhere between memory and forgetting, in the long-shadowed era before the Civil War, when the world turned slower and the nights carried a weight that few dared to name. The lanterns along the old roads burn low, their flames trembling in the humid breath of the southern autumn. It is Halloween, or what passed for it in the old states then, a night steeped in quiet superstition and haunted silences, when even the devout cross themselves twice before blowing out a candle. Before we step into this world, I invite you to settle wherever you are. If you are listening from the city, from a small town, from a quiet room filled with the soft hum of a lamp, or perhaps from far away across oceans, I welcome you. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is where you are now. Is it evening, midnight, or the pale hours before dawn when the world feels thinner and your breath sounds louder? Adjust your blanket, ease into the warmth of your chair or bed, and let the noise of the present fade for a while. We are travelling back to a night that no longer remembers itself, and yet still lingers in the corners of old houses and forgotten prayers. The candle burns unevenly tonight. Its wick leans to one side, its flame bending like a weary spine. The wax gathers in thick tears that spill slowly down the brass holder, glistening in the dim light. It sits on a rough wooden table beside a Bible, whose pages are swollen from humidity and handling. The words inside are blurred by age, smudged by fingers that trembled while reading. Around it, the air holds the scent of turpentine and dust, the perfume of a world both pious and decaying. The walls of the small cabin seem to exhale with each flicker of light, as if even the timbers remember the burdens of the living. Outside, the fields stretch in every direction, black as ink beneath the overcast sky. Rows of cornstalks, brittle and dry, stand motionless except when the wind moves through them in slow waves, their rustle carrying faint echoes of old hymns and whispered fears. Beyond the fields lies a line of pines so dense they swallow the moonlight whole. The locals say that if you walk too far into those woods after sundown, you can hear the sound of footsteps that never find their source. They speak softly about that place, calling it the Road of the Lost, for they believe the dead sometimes wander there, searching for what they left behind. Inside the cabin, a family sits close around the fire. The room is narrow, with one small window shuttered tight against the night. The father's hands rest on his knees, scarred and strong, the calluses built from years of labouring in soil that never gave back what it took. His gaze is fixed on the flames, his expression unreadable. The mother sits nearby, her shoulders wrapped in a faded shawl. She hums softly under her breath, a tune with no beginning and no end, one she learned from her own mother long ago. The sound fills the silence like smoke curling through the rafters. Low, steady, unbroken. The children are gathered near her feet. The eldest, a boy of 12, stares into the fire as though trying to understand what it consumes. His sister leans against him, her hair falling loose over her shoulders, her fingers tracing shapes into the dirt floor. The youngest child, barely 4, clutches a wooden doll with half its paint worn away. Her eyes move constantly toward the door, listening for something that might not exist. On the hearth, a pot of water simmers quietly. The steam carries the scent of sage and something faintly metallic, an old remedy, a tradition from their grandmother's time. She is gone now, buried on the hill beyond the creek, but her habits remain, stitched into the nightly rituals of the house. The mother still sets a plate of bread and salt on the mantel each Halloween, though she no longer says why. The father never removes it until morning. Some things, he believes, are best left unquestioned. The night presses close against the walls. The sound of the wind through the pines rises and falls, like distant breathing. The candle flame bends again, then steadies. The father glances toward it, his brow furrowing slightly. He knows what his neighbors would say, that a flame leaning toward the east means a visitor is near, living or dead. He does not mention it. The others do not ask. The silence holds its shape. Far off, the faint clang of a metal chain echoes through the fields. Perhaps a loose gate, perhaps not. The eldest boy shifts, his hand brushing against the rough handle of the carving knife resting on the table. They had used it earlier to cut a small gourd, hollowing it with careful hands and placing a stub of tallow inside. It was not tradition in this part of the country to carve such things, but the children had heard of it from travellers and begged to try. The result sits now on the windowsill, its crooked smile glowing faintly through the shutter cracks. Its light is weak, trembling, but it feels like a watchful eye guarding the small space between the living and whatever moves outside. The fire snaps, scattering a few sparks that die before touching the floor. The mother rises slowly and tends to it, adding another piece of wood. Her movements are unhurried, deliberate, as though she fears to break the fragile rhythm of the night. The boy watches her, noticing the slight tremor in her hands. The father leans forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze never leaving the flames. He begins to speak, his voice low, the drawl of the southern countryside smoothing the edges of each word. "Your grandfather used to say," he murmurs, "that the dead don't rest easy this time of year. Not out here. Not after all that's been done on this land." The boy says nothing. The girl glances up, eyes wide. The mother keeps stirring the pot, pretending not to hear, though the rhythm of her spoon slows. "They say," the father continues, "the soil remembers blood. Every drop. It don't forget. You can bury it, plough over it, build your house on top of it. But come All Hallows Eve, the ground breathes what it knows." The fire crackles softly. No one speaks. Outside, the wind shifts direction, blowing against the shutters with a sound like fingers dragging over wood. The mother finally sets the spoon down. Her voice is calm, but the words come carefully, as if chosen from memory rather than belief. "Best not to invite such talk into the house." The father nods, though his eyes remain fixed on the fire. The children return to their quiet watch. For a long time, the only sounds are the sigh of the wind, the crackle of the flames, and the slow ticking of an unseen clock. Somewhere in the distance, a hound begins to howl. It is a long, mournful sound that carries over the fields like a warning. The mother draws her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The youngest child whimpers softly, burying her face into the folds of her sister's dress. The eldest boy feels the urge to stand, to look out the window, but he does not move. He knows better than to break the stillness once the night begins to listen. The hound's cry fades. In its place comes another sound, faint but distinct. A steady knocking, far away at first, then closer. It is not at their door, not yet, but somewhere along the road. The echo of wood against wood, like a loose shutter tapping in the wind. The boy's breath catches. The father lifts his head slightly, listening. The sound stops as suddenly as it began. The candle flickers once more, leaning toward the door. The mother crosses herself. Her lips move, forming a prayer so old it no longer has a name. The fire dims, then flares again, casting the room in uneven light. Shadows crawl up the walls, shifting slowly like figures half-formed from smoke. The children huddle closer. The father stands, stretching his back, his gaze moving toward the window. He can see nothing through the cracks, only the faint glow of the gourd's smile trembling in the wind. The air feels heavier now. The smell of the sage deepens, thick and sharp. The mother dips a branch of it into the simmering water and waves it gently through the air, letting the steam curl toward the corners of the room. The grandmother had done the same every year, saying it cleared the way for the living. The father had once laughed at it, calling it foolishness. He no longer laughs. Beyond the pines, thunder murmurs low and distant, though no storm has been seen for days. The sky outside must be changing, the wind shifting with it. The mother finishes her task and sets the branch on the mantel beside the bread and salt. The flames catch the movement of her hand, and for a brief moment, her shadow stretches across the wall, tall and thin, bending strangely at the head as though something unseen has leaned beside her. She turns back quickly, but nothing is there. The father sits again, his jaw tight. The children's eyes dart from him to the door, to the window, to the candle that seems smaller with each passing minute. The room feels alive, breathing quietly around them. Even the floorboards creak under their weight, as though the house itself listens. The night deepens, and the line between silence and sound grows thinner. The air outside carries the faint cry of a whip-poor-will, a bird that many here believe sings only for the dead. Its call echoes once, twice, then fades into the hum of insects and the slow rustle of wind through the pine needles. The mother's hand moves again over the pot, slow circles, steady and careful. The youngest child's eyes begin to close, though her small hand still grips the wooden doll tightly. The father leans back, the chair groaning under his weight. He exhales a slow breath, as if settling into patience rather than comfort. "It'll pass," he mutters. "The night always passes." The words are meant for reassurance, but even he does not sound convinced. The fire burns lower, the candle gutters, the shadows along the wall stretch longer still. Somewhere outside, something shifts in the cornfield. Too heavy for the wind, too slow for any creature. The sound comes once, then again, then stops. The boy's hand reaches instinctively toward the knife on the table, though his father's quiet glance stops him. The older man shakes his head. Some things, his eyes say, are not to be met with steel. The mother's hum returns, soft and unbroken, filling the gaps between each creak and sigh. The grandmother's song lives on in that sound, old as the soil beneath them. The eldest girl begins to murmur the words under her breath, the faintest harmony threading through the air. The rhythm holds. The flame steadies. The night, for a moment, seems to wait. And in that pause, as the fire breathes and the wind slips quiet between the pines, the world feels suspended, neither safe nor threatened, neither past nor present. The candle burns a little lower, its wax pooling around the base like a clock marking invisible hours. Somewhere far beyond the fields, thunder rolls again, slow and hollow, the sound of the world remembering something it would rather forget. The father's gaze drifts once more to the window. The gourd's light still flickers faintly through the cracks. Its crooked smile trembles, its eyes hollow but alive. And behind it, for just a heartbeat, another light seems to move. Small, pale, uncertain, like a candle carried by an unseen hand walking the road that leads through the pines. The father blinks, and it's gone. He says nothing. The night does not ask for words. The candle gutters once more, fighting against the dark. The flame bends westward now, toward the fields, toward the place where the ground remembers. The mother's song fades to a whisper, and the long Halloween night begins to breathe in earnest. The road that cuts through the pines begins as a ribbon of packed earth rising gently from the edge of the field, then slips into the trees as if the forest had been waiting with open hands. The wind changes once you step from the last row of corn into the first shadows beneath the boughs. Out in the open, the air moves in long, easy strokes. Here, it drifts in short breaths, carrying the resin-sweet scent of sap and the sour trace of old rain trapped in needles that never fully dry. The sound of the world changes too. The insects thin. The birds fall silent. The forest draws noise into itself and makes it small. The boy carries the lantern in his right hand and keeps the knife in the pocket of his coat, not because he means to use it, but because a small weight near the ribs feels like company. The wick's glow is steady for a few steps, then pulls sideways when a draft slips across the path. He tightens his grip and lifts the tin a little higher. The flame regains itself and stays that way. His sister follows a pace behind, the hem of her dress brushing the weeds at the edge where pine shade meets the pale grass that somehow grows here despite the needles. She presses her lips together and sets one foot carefully in front of the other, tracking her toes through the same prints the boy leaves. Behind them, the father watches from the field's mouth with arms crossed. He is small now in the boy's sight, already framed by the last of the corn stalks. The orange pulse of the hearth behind him softened to a faint memory in the window. The father does not call them back. He has said the lanterns must be set where the road bends twice and once more where it sinks toward the creek. Just enough light to guide a traveller and keep whatever walks outside the light from forgetting where the living live. The pines climb close together and lean in. Some trunks stand straight, others twist as if turned by slow hands. Sap beads glisten in the lantern and catch a pale gleam that slips off like breath from glass. The needles underfoot make a bed that gives a little with each step. The boy listens for small things. A squirrel would rustle quickly and quit. A snake would whisper through the needles with no pause. A line of sound that travels straight. But this is something else. The quiet held too evenly. The way the forest hushes not from sleep, but from attention. They come to the first place the road bends, where a stump sits like a low stool, and a thin-limbed maple leans out from the pines, as if it had crept here overnight. The boy rests the lantern on the stump and kneels to set a jar next to it. The jar is glass grown clouded with age and washed thin at the lip. Inside it, a wick floats in oil. He strikes flint, turns the wheel, and gives the jar its small flame. The maple's leaves barely move, yet the jar's light stirs, as if touched. He adjusts the wick and watches it sharpen. His sister folds her arms for warmth and looks down the road, then to the dark between the trunks. She doesn't speak. Her eyes say enough. The boy nods at nothing in particular, lifts the travelling lantern again, and keeps on. They pass a fallen tree half swallowed by needles. Beetles have tunnelled through the soft wood, leaving it riddled like bread. That log has the look of a bridge, but it crosses nothing. A crow feather rests in the notch where bark meets soil, too clean to have lain long. The girl glances at it and then away, as if not seeing might keep it from meaning anything. The boy notices a second feather tucked beside the first, the two making a faint arrow toward the deeper trees. He does not touch them. He steps around the log and keeps to the road's pale centre, where cartwheels long ago polished the dirt until it held the memory of motion even when no one came. A faint damp smell rises as the path sinks toward the creek. The air cools by small degrees. The boy thinks of the field they left, of the house's single window between them and the hearth, of the slice of gourd glowing through the shutter cracks. He feels distance settling like dust on his coat. He does not turn. The sister's breath is steady, barely visible, close enough that he could touch her sleeve without reaching far. She lifts her hand once to tuck hair behind her ear, and her fingers tremble only a little. The second bend comes at a place where roots cross the road like ribs. Here the pine needles thin, and the earth shows raw, pale, and scarred. The boy stops to set another jar. "It should go on a stone," the father said, "not on soil, because flame and rock know one language, and flame and dirt know another." He finds a flat piece of granite half buried and scrapes it with his palm until the grit loosens and his hand smells like wet chalk. He sets the jar there and lights it. The wick takes quickly. The small circle of light catches a shape at the road's edge, a ring of iron set deep into a post, the wood around it scarred from rope that once held firm and then slipped. The ring the colour of old blood. The boy looks away, not because he is afraid of iron, but because he knows what had been tied here long ago or last year or last week. Time has a way of refusing to declare itself in these woods. He does not speak. The jar's flame draws his eyes back. He checks it twice, then stands and moves on. They hear water before they see it. Not a strong run, not a broad wash, only a steady thread slipping over stones worn thumb-smooth by years of the same motion. The pines open a little at the creek's lip. The girl reaches for the boy's sleeve and holds there, not to stop him, but to match his step. The creek is narrow enough for a jump, too wide for a careless one. The boy lays a board that the father had left here last spring. The wood is grey at the edges and soft where the creek's breath has gnawed at it, and tests it with his heel. It bows slightly but holds. He crosses with the lantern held high and turns to watch his sister follow. She keeps her eyes on his shoulder and comes across in a careful line, the board answering with the smallest groan and then letting her pass. On the far bank, the ground rises into a hummock where no tree grows. A small space like a room with no walls. The boy knows this place. He has played here on days when the sun returned and the pines smelled like warm pitch. He has also seen candles placed here on nights when the air had gone still and words were said over names no one says in daylight. He does not play now. He sets the third jar on a flat stone that wears a faint notch at one edge. A mark like the beginning of a carved letter. He strikes the flint, catches spark in oil, and a thin flame stands. He holds his hand above it. The heat is soft and sure. The girl stares across the creek into a pocket of trees that hold their shadows differently from the rest. The needles there look darker, and the space between trunks looks too narrow for a person to pass. She grips the doll she carried from the house, a thing with one painted eye and one plain circle where the other used to be. She does not lift it like a shield. She just holds it to keep her hands full. The boy glances the same way and finds the pressure in his chest loosen when the trees offer nothing back. He lifts the travelling lantern and starts again. The path climbs a little, and with each step the damp smell thins, replaced by the dry breath of resin and leaf mould turned to dust. The jars behind them cast 3 soft islands that do not speak to one another. A strip of road between each light holds its own dark. The boy thinks, only for a heartbeat, how a man could walk between such islands forever if he kept his eyes on his feet and never raised his head to see that the line did not end. He shuts the thought away and counts his steps like nails tapped into a beam. The forest gives a break ahead. a lighter patch where the road widens before it turns toward the fence line that frames the old house standing beyond the trees. The boy cannot see the boards yet, but he knows the place by the way wind from the field sneaks under the pine branches. A cooler breath touches his face, carrying a dry smell of corn husks and the distant ash of kitchen fires burning down for the night. He wants the sight of that fence the way a thirsty man wants a creek, not because boards keep him safe, but because lines mean the world has edges. He pauses when a new sound threads through the needles, not footsteps, not wind. A slow tap, measured and spare, like a wooden spoon on a table, once and then again, with too much time between for impatience and not enough for comfort. He angles the lantern toward the sound and sees only the ordinary interior of a forest, thick with trunks and low brush, small branches hung with a grey moss that looks like breath caught and frozen. The tap comes once more and then quits. His sister squeezes his sleeve. He doesn't tell her he heard it. He doesn't tell her he didn't. He starts walking and lets the path do its work. They pass a crude cross-braced marker the hunters set last winter, where the road splits into 3 deer paths. White cloth still clings to one arm of the brace, tied by hands that had meant to find the place again, and never did. The boy has been told to leave markers untouched. The cloth whispers against the wood as if it wanted to speak and had been told not to. A knot in the brace looks like an eye pressed shut. He keeps moving until the path draws him toward a thin rail laid across 2 posts, like a rung. Beyond it, the understory opens, and a cut runs straight as a rule through the trees, a line used by men who drive cattle now and then when they must. No one drives anything tonight. The boy smells smoke that does not belong to their hearth. Not strong smoke, not a burning, the faintest ghost of it, as if a candle had just been blown out and the breath of that act hung in the air, unsure whether to rise or sink. He stops and sets the lantern on a stump to listen. His sister listens too. The sound of the creek no longer reaches. In its place, the forest settles its weight around them, needles shifting in a scalpel's thin choir overhead. Something small walking by, feel beyond the reach of light, the long hush that comes when a place is waiting for a decision. He decides to light the 4th jar here, not because his father told him to, but because the road ahead narrows between 2 pines that grew leaning toward each other, and he would rather that mouth speak with a flame set to one side. He kneels, pulls wick with careful fingers so it will catch at the first spark, and looks up just briefly while the flint wheel bites. A figure stands at the far end of the narrow, or a piece of an idea that makes the mind shape a figure. Tall, still, wide at the shoulders. The lantern flare spills and then steadies. The space is empty again. The girl's breath, which had gone shallow, deepens. The boy does not say what he saw. People see shapes in the woods even at noon, the father always said, and at night the trees lend themselves to stories. Even so, the boy's fingers stumble as he screws the jar's lid. He sets the flame on a flat root and stands. Voices like memory pass between the closer trunks and drift out again. Not words. The suggestion that words were once there. He thinks of the ring around that earlier post. He thinks of rope burned into wood. He thinks of the Bible on the table and the way his mother's hand shook when she turned the page, not because she had doubts about the verses, but because some letters weigh more than others when read in a room that knows how they were used. He adjusts his coat and keeps walking. The path dips into a shallow hollow, floored with needles matted to a felt. The smell here is old and sweet, like a barn in late summer when hay has grown damp under the top layer. He has never brought the lanterns this far. His father usually sets the last jar himself just before the fence. But this year, the man stayed with the hearth and his eyes and his silence. The boy feels a new sort of duty sitting on his shoulders, like a tool he has not yet learned to use. He steps with more care. Something shifts to their left, not big enough to crack a branch, but near enough to weave their attention into a single thread. The sister stops. The boy lifts the lantern and moves it toward the sound. It catches the glint of eyes for a heartbeat low to the ground. A fox or a dog, the colour impossible to read in this light. The gleam slides away with a soft breath of needles. The girl loosens her grip on the doll by a fraction. The boy lets the lantern drop back to his side, glad for the small answer of a living thing that behaves as living things do. He finds the hollow's far rim and climbs out. At the top, he sees the fence at last. Split rails stacked in the old manner, corners braced with crossed stakes, the whole line shifting with the ground's slow heave over years of rain and heat. Between the rails and the road stands a patch of sumac, each branch crowned with a red cone of seed, like a candle left to harden. The fence looks low from a distance, but near it the rails keep their counsel and offer no place to pass without consent. Beyond them, a field lies open and pale, and beyond that, the house with the red door waits with its face turned toward the trees. He feels the house before he sees it clear. Some buildings hold their quiet as a kindness. Others press it out over the ground like a hand. This one does not push, but it does not retreat. The road and the fence and the first steps of the field stand inside the same breath the house breathes. He hears the low ring of metal against metal once, a sound that might be a hook settling in its staple or a hitch catching and swinging a finger's width. His sister hears it too. She sets the doll inside her coat and buttons it to the neck. Her mouth makes a line across her face that means she will not cry, and she will not speak unless she must. The boy lights the 5th jar and sets it on the fence post where the rails meet at a corner. The flame leans and then draws upright as if accepting the spot. The jar's light turns the nearby sumac heads a deep rust. He lifts the lantern and steps toward the break in the fence line, where 2 rails have fallen inward to make a crooked gate. The gap is narrow, but passable. He slips through and waits for his sister to follow. The board's old grey rubs dust on their sleeves. The ground inside feels different underfoot, not softer, but more attentive, as if the field had learned long ago to listen to what moves across it. They walk the last stretch to the house with the lantern tucked close, the jar burning behind them at the fence like a small watcher. The windows in the front wall hold no light. The red door is darker than paint should be in a night like this, a shade at the edge of black, where red reads as memory more than colour. The step before it is cracked across the middle with a thin seam that runs end to end. The boy looks at that seam and thinks of water freezing in a crevice and swelling the first hairline into a wound. He thinks of hands that might have rapped on that door, with knuckles bruised, and of feet that might have stood on that step and felt the earth take the knock before the house did. He does not mount the step. He angles left, where the porch gives a sliver of shelter against rain, and sets the 6th jar on a sill that once held a growing box. The glass shows smears shaped like fingers, old enough to be part of the wood now. He lights the wick and watches it take. A moth arrives from nowhere and circles once, twice, then quits, landing where the heat holds steady. He remembers the mother's quiet warning about letting small creatures find their own way in a night like this, and leaves it be. The yard on this side of the house sinks toward a shallow swale, a depression the rain favours. The boy sees the pale shape of stones set in a short row. 5 of them, none tall, all canted. The first leans toward the house like a person trying to hear through a closed door. He cannot read what might be carved on them, if anything, and he does not step closer. The sister keeps to the packed path that curves between porch and swale, her shoes scraping softly. She glances once toward the stones and then lifts her chin to the sky, where a thin break in the cloud admits a slice of moon. The light that falls through it looks cold against the jar's warm circle, a blade laid beside a hearth poker. The boy sets the 7th jar near the corner, where 2 walls meet. The boards there are newer, a different grain and a different paint, as if a repair had been made after something gave way. He fits the jar into a notch at the base and listens. The house gives a sound he knows in his bones. Wood answering temperature, a slow adjustment. A groan that means nothing has broken and everything has remembered to hold. Another sound follows, higher and faster. The faint clatter of a loose latch somewhere inside, shaken by a draught that should not exist behind a sealed door. He straightens and turns the lantern a fraction toward the red plane of the door itself. The paint is worn smooth at shoulder height, and lower down a different kind of wear shows. Not from hands, not from weather. A long arc an inch high that curves like the scratch made by a heavy nail dragged in a circle by someone who had time. He hears steps behind him and knows them for his sister's. She stops close enough that he can feel the small heat of her body in the cool air. She says his name in a voice that holds no question, only a need to set the sound of it between them. He answers with a small sound that is not a word and not nothing. He moves along the porch and looks toward the yard that meets the kitchen wall. The ground there is bare, swept to hard dirt, as if brooms still rise and fall here, even when no one holds them. He sets the 8th jar on a brick beside the door that opens to that yard. The door stands shut, but the strip at its bottom shows a line where dust has been pushed out from time to time. He tilts his head and finds the shape of a shoe in that dust, not fresh, not old, pressed clear enough to hold, blurred enough to deny. He does not tell his sister. She is seeing what she needs too, and nothing more. They circle to the back, where a narrow porch collapses into the ground with one corner sunk. A cistern sits beside it, the wooden cover swelled and split, an iron ring set into its centre flashing a dull half-moon in the lantern. The boy tests the boards with his foot and decides not to put weight there. He kneels instead at the edge and positions the 9th jar on the flat of a step that holds. The flame takes the first try. The air at his cheek cools as if something had moved away from him at the moment the light arrived. He steadies his breath and stands. Beyond the backyard, the field drops toward a strip of blackberry, tangled like wire, then rises again toward the tree line that hems the far side. A fence there holds no corners, only straight runs with posts so far apart the rails sag. He can make out the pale hint of another house beyond the far fence, smaller, its roofline low, the whole of it turned away as if it had learned long ago to keep its back to this place after sundown. He wonders, not for the first time, how a house learns anything. He wonders how a field remembers. He wonders how the ground chooses to keep some footprints and swallow others before a second step is taken. He finishes the circle with the 10th jar near the second front corner, placing it where the porch meets the step and the first rail of the fence kisses the yard's edge. The light lines up with the one at the fence farther back, making a crooked strand that would look, from a hill, like a seam sewn with uneven stitches across the night. He imagines his father standing near the creek and seeing their glow and counting, finding comfort in numbers that add to the right sum. The boy keeps the last 2 jars for the road home. It is the way his father taught him. Never leave a path without light set along the way back, lest the dark rearrange itself while you look the other way. He turns and leads his sister the length of the fence to the gap where they came through. The jar on the corner still burns. He sets the 11th a yard beyond it on the fence's inner face, so the field's edge will recognize itself, then passes out through the fallen rails and back onto the road. The girl steps close behind, eyes on the place where light and shadow exchange a handshake. They start for the creek again at a pace longer than before. Behind them, the house does not watch with malice, and it does not bless. It stands. The jars they left at its corners shape small fields of certainty that do not entirely cancel the uncertainty in between. The boy feels the strain in his shoulders loosen, not relief, not exactly, more like the easing of a rope after a load has been set down without breaking the plank that took the weight. The sister's breath matches his by chance. A frog calls once from the swale. A nightbird answers with a single syllable like a note struck on glass. They cross the fence gap and find the road quieter than before, as if the pines had listened to their passing and made up their minds about whether to allow their return. The lantern's flame steadies. The boy does not turn it toward every sound now. He understands the kind that requires sight, and the kind that will only grow larger if given too much attention. He keeps to the center of the path, steps strong and even, the girl's shoes marking time a heartbeat later. At the creek, the board still lies where he set it. The water speaks the same small language. He tests the board and sends the sister across first this time, her feet light on the wet wood, her hands spread for balance, her coat brushing his knuckles as she passes. He crosses and lifts the board to drag it a pace uphill so flood or hand will not carry it off before it is needed again. He sets the 12th jar on the hummock above the far bank and lights it, a small stake marking the point where the road is a road again and not a compromise. They climb the shallow rise past the iron ring's post and go on toward the first jar, the one on the stone scraped clean. The flame there bends briefly when the lantern's heat touches it and then regains its line. The cloth on the hunter's brace whispers again. A shape crosses the path 20 yards ahead, low to the ground, smooth as poured water. The boy's breath catches and then releases. He finds the stump where the first jar burns and sees the pale circle of their field open beyond the last trunks. The window of their house shows an ember-coloured smear that could be a flame or could be the candle remembering the idea of one. He does not speak until his boots stand in the field's soft furrows. Then he tells his sister quietly that she did well, though the words do not come dressed like praise. They come plain and steady, and she nods once, understanding. The cornstalks rattle their dry hands together as a breeze moves across the rows. The house grows larger with each step, the red at its door a truer colour than the one at the other place. The father stands at the edge of the yard where the field yields to packed dirt, arms still crossed, chin raised a little as if scenting the air. He does not ask what they saw. He counts silently and tilts his head as though he hears the line of jars speaking to one another, the farthest flame telling the nearer one a truth it must carry home. They reach him and stop. He touches the boy's shoulder with a hand that holds and lets go in the same motion, then looks to the sister and finds her eyes and holds them with his for a second longer. He turns toward the door and the breath of the hearth that seeps through the wood like warmth leaking through a coat seam. The mother will be at the pot. The youngest will have slipped towards sleep and then back from it when the draught lifted the corner of that single blanket they share. The Bible will sit where it sat, heavier now for reasons none of them will say out loud. The father lifts the latch. The door opens with a dry sigh. The night outside leans back a step as the house's heat reaches across the threshold. The jars burn in the distance where they were left, each small circle patient, each flame steady, as if relieved to have its duty named. The boy steps in behind his sister, keeping the lantern low. The father shuts the door against the field's cool breath and the line of pines that hold their counsel. The room receives them with the same plain acceptance it gave when they left. The mother glances up and reads what she needs in the angle of their shoulders, in the way the boy sets the lantern down without letting his hand leave the handle, in the way the girl draws her coat closed at the throat and then opens it again to pull the doll free and set it carefully on the table as if placing a witness. The youngest stirs and sits, her hair pressed flat on one side from sleep. She rubs her eyes and watches her brother's face. He nods once, and her mouth softens. The father moves to the hearth and drags the poker through the coals. The embers answer with a low red bloom. He lays a new piece of oak and waits while the first lick of flame catches. The mother returns to her slow circle with the spoon, thicker now, steady in the wrist. The house breathes. Outside, the road through the pines holds its shape between the islands of light, and the fence beyond holds the line between field and yard, where the fallen rails make a passing place. The jars at the corners of the other house burn where the boy set them, the small moth resting near one. The swale stones tip the way time has always tipped them. The creek speaks its thin word over the stone lip. Somewhere in the trees, a branch breaks under the weight of nothing heavier than the night. The ring in the old post remembers rope. The boy feels the weight in his coat pocket where the knife rests and leaves it there. The flame on the table leans a fraction toward the east, then straightens again. The father watches the door without staring at it. The mother sets a plate of bread and salt higher on the mantel, so the youngest will not bump it. The girl sits where she can see the window and the slice of Gord's grin, still pulsing faintly through the shutter seam. She keeps her hands on her knees so they will not fold into a prayer that would call attention to itself. The youngest hums once, then stops, and looks at the grandmother's chair as if expecting it to give an answer. The road waits with its quiet segments of certainty. The pines tilt their heads and listen. The fence beyond the field keeps its turnings and its gaps. The house with the red door does not move, does not speak, does not sleep. The night continues with the careful balance of a room where everyone knows what they owe, and the ground outside remembers the debt. The light from the hearth had settled into a calm, steady glow that flattened the shadows along the walls and deepened them under the table. The boy sat near the window, with the lantern dark beside him, the wick curled and cold. The smell of burned tallow still lingered, faint and sweet, as if the night itself had pressed its face against the glass before withdrawing. The father had spoken little since they returned. He had checked each latch, lifted the bar across the door, and stirred the fire until the wood caught strong enough to burn through till morning. The mother's spoon moved slow circles in the pot, keeping to its rhythm like a clock that refused to strike the hour. The youngest had fallen asleep again, the doll tucked against her stomach, the head turned sideways as though it too listened for the wind. Beyond the window, the fields lay pale and colourless under a sky that had begun to open, the clouds thinning into long grey ribbons that held the faint promise of stars. Somewhere out there, past the rows of lantern jars and the line of the creek, stood the other house, the one they spoke of only when they had to, and even then not by name. It sat where the land tilted slightly, where the earth never quite dried no matter how long the sun stayed up. The house with the red door had been empty for years, though empty never meant silent. Travellers had passed it in daylight and felt the air grow still enough to muffle their own breath. No one in the family remembered who built it. Some said it had stood before the war that came and went long before the boy was born, and that its boards were cut from trees felled on a night when no one should have been working. Others said it had belonged to a man who kept to himself and died that way, found weeks later with the door shut and the fire still smoking inside. The truth, whatever it was, stayed buried with him. The boy knew only what the land remembered. He had seen the place often from a distance, the red door dimming year after year until it seemed more a stain than a colour. In daylight, it could pass for an ordinary house, 2 windows on each side, a roof sagging slightly, chimney leaning like an elbow pressed against the sky. But at dusk, when the air thickened and the pine shadows stretched across the field, the house looked different. The walls seemed to draw breath. The glass in the windows caught light where none should fall. Even the birds avoided its roof. He had never gone closer than the fence until tonight, when the jars were lit and his father's absence made it his turn to carry the weight of the task. Now, back inside, with the warmth of the hearth touching his back, he could still feel the other house watching through the dark. The mother set the ladle down and wiped her hands on her apron. Her eyes found the father's and lingered. "It's done," she said. "They've set the lights." He nodded. "They'll burn till morning." Her gaze dropped to the boy. "Did you see anyone on the road?" The boy hesitated, not because he meant to lie, but because the question itself was too large. He thought of the figure that might have stood at the end of the narrowing path, the one that vanished when the lantern flare steadied. He thought of the sound of tapping wood and the shape that crossed ahead of them on the return, low to the ground, too smooth to be anything ordinary. "No," he said at last. "Just the wind." The father studied him for a moment, then looked toward the window. The faint glow of the nearest jar showed through the glass like a star trembling at the edge of the field. "Then it's done," he repeated. The mother ladled the thick broth into bowls and set them on the table. Steam rose in slow spirals, carrying the smell of sage and bone. They ate in silence. The youngest stirred once, half waking, and murmured something that might have been a name. The mother reached over and brushed the child's hair from her forehead, the motion practiced and absent-minded. Outside, the wind shifted again. The boards creaked in reply, not complaining, just answering. When the bowls were empty, the father leaned back in his chair and looked at the flames. "It's colder than it should be," he said. "Ground's holding something." The mother didn't answer. She collected the dishes and carried them to the basin. The boy kept his eyes on the fire, tracing the patterns of the embers where red turned to white, then grey. His sister sat with her knees drawn up, chin resting on them, her gaze lost in the small motions of light on the wall. The youngest breathed evenly, her hand still curled around the doll's arm. The air felt thicker now, heavy with something that couldn't be named, the kind of weight that settles over a room when no one wants to move first. The father stood and went to the door. He lifted the latch but did not open it. He pressed his palm against the wood as though feeling for a pulse. "Someone's been walking the fence line," he said softly. "The dog's been quiet all night, but I heard the rails shift earlier." The mother turned from the basin. "Could be the wind." He shook his head. "Wind don't move rails." The boy rose without thinking, the motion quick, instinctive. His father's eyes met his. "You'll stay inside," the man said. "Whatever's out there can keep its distance." The boy hesitated, then sat again. The father lowered the latch and stepped back. The fire cracked sharply, a burst of sparks flying upward before fading into the chimney's throat. The sound filled the pause that followed, a kind of punctuation the night supplied on its own. The mother wiped her hands and crossed herself. The father returned to his chair, his expression unreadable. The wind pressed against the shutters once, twice, then settled. The house seemed to sigh with it. The boy thought of the other door, the one painted red, and wondered if it too was being tested by the same wind. He pictured the jars burning along the fence, their light faint and isolated, each one a small defiance against the dark. He imagined the road beyond them, the pines leaning in, the creek whispering over the stones, and somewhere beyond all that, the house with the red door standing quiet, its walls holding stories no one alive could still tell. He didn't realize he'd spoken until the words were already in the air. "Why's it still standing?" he asked. The father looked up. "What?" "The red door," the boy said. "That house should have fallen by now." The father's jaw tightened. "Some things don't fall easy." The mother turned. "Don't bring it up tonight." He nodded, but his eyes stayed on the boy. "Your grandfather helped build that place," he said finally. "Worked on it when he was young, said the wood was green when they cut it, never dried right. You can hear it still shifting if you stand near it long enough." The boy waited. The father's voice had changed, lower now, slower. "He said there was a man lived thereafter, a preacher or something close to it. Spoke the word by day, did his own work by night. Folks came to him for healing. Some left better, some didn't leave at all. Then one full night, after a rain like the world was washing itself clean, that red door shut and didn't open again. Smoke kept rising from the chimney for 3 days. On the 4th, nothing. They went to look, found the house locked from the inside. The mother's spoon slipped from her fingers and clattered against the basin. The sound was loud in the small room. "That's enough," she said sharply. "You'll fill their heads with ghosts." The father didn't answer. The fire popped again, softer this time. The boy looked toward the window. The glass reflected the room, the family, the small ordinary world contained within 4 walls. But behind that reflection, if he looked long enough, he thought he saw a deeper shadow, something not quite aligned with the rest of the night. The mother gathered the dishes and stacked them neatly, her movements precise. The eldest girl stood and began folding the blanket that had slipped from the youngest's shoulders. The father remained by the fire, staring into the flames. The boy turned his gaze back to the window, to the faint outline of the field, and felt the hair on his arms lift. A single sound drifted across the distance, soft, rhythmic, deliberate. The same knocking he'd heard before, only closer now. 3 slow taps, a pause, then one more. The mother froze. The father lifted his head. "Could be a branch," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The knocking came again, clearer. The boy's heart beat against his ribs, a dull thud that matched the rhythm of the sound. The father stood. "Stay put," he said. He crossed the room, lifted the latch, and opened the door a few inches. Cold air swept in, carrying the scent of pine and damp soil. The night outside was still, the kind of stillness that made sound feel heavier. The jars on the fence flickered faintly, their light too distant to reach the porch. The father stepped out, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He scanned the yard, the field, the line where dark met darker. Nothing moved. "Anything," the mother called softly. He shook his head and shut the door. "Just the wind," he said again, though his eyes told another story. The boy watched as his father bolted the latch and returned to his chair. The fire's light caught the edge of his face, carving it into sharper lines. The room fell quiet except for the slow rhythm of the flames. The boy's sister leaned her head against her knees and closed her eyes. The mother resumed her work, though her hands moved slower now. The youngest turned in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. The night pressed closer against the windows. The father stared into the fire until his breathing matched its rhythm. "Whatever's walking the fields," he said softly. "It's not coming from town. Roads are too quiet. Could be from the creek. Could be from there." He didn't have to say which there. The word itself was enough. The mother's hand stilled. "You think it's him?" The father didn't answer. He leaned forward and poked the embers until they flared. "The land remembers," he said finally. "Sometimes it sends reminders." The boy swallowed hard. "What kind of reminders?" The father looked at him. "The kind that don't forget where they came from." The wind rose again, brushing the walls with a low, steady moan. The flame in the candle bent westward toward the road. The mother crossed herself and whispered a prayer the boy didn't recognize. The sound of it blended with the creak of the house, the sigh of the wind, the faint crackle of the fire. For a moment, everything seemed to move in time with something unseen. Then, as quietly as it had come, the wind stopped. The candle straightened. The boy glanced toward the window. The glass showed only his reflection now, the outline of his face, the flicker of the fire behind him. But beneath that faint image, the red door hovered in his mind, bright against the dark. He could see it as clearly as if he were standing before it again, the paint peeling at the edges, the handle dull with age. He could imagine the air around it, heavy with the smell of smoke and rain. And he could almost hear the faint sound of a latch lifting from the other side, slow and careful, like something long asleep, remembering how to move. The mother gathered the children and guided them toward their beds. The father stayed near the fire, eyes fixed on the flames. The boy lay down beside his brother and stared at the ceiling beams, tracing the patterns the light made across the wood. Sleep didn't come quickly. Every sound, the shift of the walls, the whisper of the wind, the faint scrape of branches against the roof, felt heavier, sharper. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent. He thought of the jars burning along the fence, the small thread of safety they offered, and wondered how long their flames would last. He thought of the red door and the stories tied to it, of the preacher and the locked house, of the smoke that rose for 3 days. He thought of the ground that never dried, of the footprints that might still be pressed into the mud beneath those pines. And as his eyes began to close, he heard, or thought he heard, the faintest echo of knocking again. Not on their door, not even near, but carried through the wind from somewhere far beyond the field. The father lifted his head slightly, as if he'd heard it too. His eyes met the window, then the dark beyond it. He didn't move. He simply waited, listening, as the sound faded back into the night. The fire dimmed, the last flames curling low over the coals. The mother's breathing settled into rhythm. The house stood still. Outside, the jars along the road burned lower. Their light trembled once, then steadied. The night held its breath, as though waiting for something to answer. The red door, somewhere beyond the trees, stayed closed, its colour lost to the dark, but its presence unchanged. The air above the field felt colder now, sharper, as if the world had tilted slightly toward whatever waited unseen. And inside the small house, the candle leaned again, its flame pointing east, toward the pines, toward the creek, toward the place where one door had never truly shut. The morning did not bring warmth, only a thinner kind of light that stretched through the gaps in the shutters and laid pale lines across the floor. The fire had burned down to a slow pulse of coals, and the smell of smoke hung low and heavy in the room. The father had already gone outside before the others stirred. His boots had made a hollow sound on the boards near the door, a noise that faded as he crossed the yard and moved toward the fields. The mother stood at the basin with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hands red from cold water. The eldest girl sat near the hearth, combing her sister's hair with fingers instead of a brush. The boy sat at the table with a piece of bread and a tin cup of milk gone lukewarm. Every so often, the wood under his feet creaked in a way that drew his eyes downward, though nothing seemed to move. The wind had quieted during the night, but the air still carried the scent of pine resin and damp soil. When the sun rose, it came through the thin clouds like a blade dulled at the edges, giving light without heat. The field looked washed out, its rows of corn stalks standing like brittle soldiers waiting for orders that would never come. The father moved among them slowly, his shoulders bent, his coat collar turned up. From the window, the boy could see the small dots of lantern jars still faintly glowing along the fence. The wicks had burned nearly to the bottom, their last flickers like tired eyes about to close. He finished the bread and set the cup aside. The mother turned from the basin. "Don't go out just yet," she said. "Let the sun rise a little higher." He nodded, but didn't move. His sister hummed quietly while she braided the youngest's hair, her voice small but steady. The sound filled the room in place of talk. The boards beneath the table creaked again, this time softer, as if touched by a hand from below. The boy looked down, waiting for the sound to fade. It did not. It came again, slow and deliberate, not the restless settling of wood, but something with rhythm. The mother heard it too. Her hand froze above the basin, drops of water falling from her fingers. The boy spoke first. "Something's moving." The mother's voice stayed calm, but the muscles in her neck tightened. "Rats, maybe. The cold brings them in." He shook his head. "Too heavy." The sound came once more, this time from beneath the hearth. A low scrape followed, faint but distinct, like a palm sliding across rough boards. The eldest girl stopped humming. The youngest turned her head toward the noise and frowned. "Someone's talking," she whispered. The mother crossed the room quickly, the heels of her shoes barely making a sound. She crouched by the hearth and listened. The boy could see her breath fog the air as she leaned closer. The noise had changed. It was no longer a scrape, but a murmur, soft and broken. Too low to make out words, yet too clear to be nothing. It rose and fell like breath, sometimes near, sometimes far, as though whoever spoke was walking in circles beneath the floor. The mother stood and wiped her hands on her apron. "Go fetch your father," she said quietly. The boy hesitated. "He's halfway through the field." "Go." He grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The air bit at his cheeks, the kind of cold that seemed to settle inside rather than on the skin. The sun had climbed higher, but had not warmed anything. His breath came out in pale clouds. As he crossed the yard, the boards near the porch gave a long groan that echoed faintly through the walls behind him. He kept walking until his boots sank into the soft edges of the field. The father straightened when he saw him coming. "What is it?" the man asked. "There's something under the floor," the boy said. "Mother said to fetch you." The father's expression didn't change. He brushed the dirt from his gloves and started back toward the house. His steps were quick but measured, as if he already knew what kind of noise he would find. When they reached the porch, he paused, his eyes scanning the ground near the steps. "Where'd it come from?" he asked. "Started under the table," the boy said. "Then near the hearth. It sounded like voices." The father didn't answer. He opened the door, and they both stepped inside. The air in the room felt heavier, the kind of weight that made even small sounds ring louder. The mother stood by the fire with her hands clasped. The girls sat on the bed, silent. The sound beneath the floor had not stopped. It came in uneven waves now, sometimes whispering, sometimes scratching, like someone trying to find a way out without being heard. The father went to the hearth and knelt. He pressed his ear against the bricks and closed his eyes. The room held its breath. The boy watched as his father's face changed. Not fear exactly, but something colder, like recognition. The man stood and looked at the boards near the wall where the wood darkened from years of smoke and heat. He moved to the table, dragged it aside, and knelt again. The boy heard the same murmur, clearer now, the words still tangled but rising through the cracks. The father whispered something the boy couldn't catch, then rose and crossed to the cupboard. He took out a small crowbar and returned to the table's empty space. The mother stepped forward. "Don't," she said softly. He glanced at her. "You'd rather not know?" Her hands tightened around her apron. Some things stay buried for a reason. He wedged the bar under the board and pressed down. The wood gave with a groan, the sound deep and wet, as if it had been holding its breath too. Dust rose in a thin cloud. The smell that came with it was old, damp, and faintly metallic. He pried another board loose and leaned it aside. The dark space beneath gaped like an open mouth. The whispering stopped. They all stood still, waiting. The silence that followed felt thick enough to touch. The father crouched again and held his hand over the opening, feeling for air. A faint draft moved past his fingers, cool and dry. He looked up at the mother. "There's a void under here," he said. "Bigger than it should be." She crossed herself and whispered something under her breath. The boy knelt beside his father and peered into the hole. The space below was too dark to see, though he thought he caught a glint of something that wasn't wood. A nail, maybe, or a piece of glass catching the faint light. The air smelled old, like rainwater trapped in a sealed jar. The father reached for a candle, lit it, and lowered it through the gap. The flame wavered, but did not go out. The light caught the curve of stone, a wall too smooth to be part of the house's foundation. The boy leaned closer. "There's something down there." The father nodded. "Help me with this." Together they lifted 2 more boards. The space beneath widened, revealing what looked like the top of a small chamber, stone-lined and circular. The edges of it had been plastered once, though most of it had flaked away. The candlelight reached just far enough to show the start of a narrow stair built into the side. The father lowered the candle further. The flame trembled, its glow catching a faint shimmer below, metal maybe, or glass. The mother's voice broke the silence. "Close it." The father didn't move. "Someone built this long before us." "Close it," she said again. "Now." He looked up at her, then back at the hole. "If something's moving down there, I need to know what." Her face had gone pale. "You won't like what you find." He stood, the candle still burning in his hand. The boy watched the light flicker across the father's face, drawing deep shadows under his eyes. "Fetch the rope from the shed," the man said quietly, "and the spade." The boy hesitated. "You're going down there?" "I'll only look." The mother stepped between them. "No one's going down," she said. "Whatever's been waiting under this house isn't meant to be disturbed." The father didn't argue. He set the candle on the floor and crouched again, lowering his head toward the opening. The boy saw his lips move, though no words came out loud. When he pulled back, his eyes were darker, focused on something beyond sight. He replaced one of the boards, pressing it down until it fit back into place with a dull thud. "We'll leave it be for now," he said. "If it's rats, they'll move on." The mother exhaled slowly, though she didn't look convinced. She wiped her hands on her apron again, a habit when her nerves showed. "We'll say a prayer tonight," she said quietly. "For the house." The father nodded. "For the house," he repeated. The day passed slowly. The whispering did not return, but the air in the room stayed thick, as if the sound had only gone deeper, waiting. The boy tried to busy himself with chores, mending a gate latch and fetching wood, but each time he crossed the threshold, the boards gave a hollow echo under his boots. The sound followed him through the house, faint but steady. The others heard it too. He could tell by the way his mother paused when she walked, and the way his sister avoided the space near the table altogether. By late afternoon, the light outside began to thin again, fading from grey to the dull brown of evening. The father came in from the field, his coat dark with sweat and soil. He dropped his tools by the door and stood for a moment, looking at the floor. "It's quieter," he said. The mother nodded. "For now." He went to the table and sat. "I'll check it again after dark." She didn't protest this time. She simply set a bowl of stew before him and turned away. The smell of sage filled the room once more, covering the damp scent that seemed to cling to everything since morning. The boy ate quietly, the spoon trembling slightly in his hand. Each time it touched the bowl, the sound carried farther than it should. When the meal was done, the father lit a lantern and knelt once more beside the hearth. He lifted one of the boards carefully, enough to let the light spill through. The space below looked the same, dark, empty, silent. He lowered the lantern until its glow touched the first step of stone. It revealed a patch of something pale against the wall. He frowned and leaned closer. It wasn't stone, it was cloth. The mother turned from the basin. "What is it?" He didn't answer at first. He reached in with the hook of the crowbar and lifted the edge of the fabric. It crumbled in his hand, turning to powder that drifted upward before settling on the boards. "Old linen," he said. "Or what's left of it." The boy saw something else beneath it, a shape that caught the light just enough to gleam. He pointed. "There's metal too." The father lowered the lantern again. The metal was curved, dull, the shape too small to be a tool. He stared at it for a long moment, then set the board back in place and pressed it down. "Nothing that concerns us," he said quietly. The mother closed her eyes and began to pray. The words came soft and steady, her voice barely above a whisper. The sound filled the room, wrapping itself around the space like a blanket. The boy listened, feeling the tension in his chest ease just slightly. When she finished, the father stood and blew out the lantern. "No more tonight," he said. "Let the house rest." They went to bed early, though none of them slept easily. The boy lay awake, listening to the faint sounds that lived in the wood, the creak of the rafters, the sigh of the wind against the walls, the slow cooling of the hearth. For a while, all was still. Then, just as his eyes began to close, the whispering returned. It was softer now, almost gentle, rising from beneath the floor like breath through cracks. The words were still too faint to understand, but he could hear the rhythm of them, a slow chant, patient and low. He turned his head toward his sister. She was awake too, her eyes open in the dim light. "Do you hear it?" he whispered. She nodded without speaking. The whispering grew stronger, not louder, but closer, as though the floor itself had begun to breathe. The boy held his breath, waiting. The sound shifted, moving from one side of the room to the other, pausing beneath each bed as if listening in return. Then it stopped beneath his own. The silence that followed was deep enough to hurt. He could feel it pressing against his chest. Then came a new sound. 3 slow taps, just like the knocking from the night before, but this time rising from below. He sat up, his heart pounding. The father stirred across the room. "Lie down," he said quietly, his voice steady. "Don't answer." The boy obeyed. The tapping came again, softer now, then faded into the whisper once more. The words slipped between the cracks, a string of syllables that sounded almost like prayer but not quite. The boy closed his eyes and tried to match his breathing to the rhythm of the sound. Eventually, the whispers sank back into the floor, dissolving into the same silence they had come from. Morning found the house unchanged but different. The air smelled faintly of earth, damp and old. The father had already gone out again, his boots leaving clean prints in the frost that had settled overnight. The mother stood by the window, her face pale in the thin light. "The ground sinking near the porch," she said quietly. The boy looked where she pointed. The soil had dipped, a small hollow that hadn't been there before. He knew without asking that it sat above the space beneath the floor. The whispering had stopped for now, but the weight of it lingered, pressing against the walls like a memory that refused to fade. He turned away from the window. The boards beneath his feet were cold. He could feel the emptiness below, the space that waited, and he knew it would not stay quiet for long. Somewhere beyond the fields, the red door stood closed, and the pines leaned closer, listening. The house held its breath. The air trembled faintly, just enough to stir the ashes in the hearth, as though the world itself had begun to whisper back. The Bible sat on the mantel where it always had, its leather darkened by smoke and the oil from generations of hands. The cover had split along the spine years ago, and one corner of the book hung loose where the stitching had failed. The pages inside were yellowed and swollen, each one thick with the moisture of countless summers. Some of the corners had curled in on themselves, the paper brittle enough that a careless touch could crumble it to dust. Yet for all its wear, the book had a presence that no one in the house could ignore. It wasn't opened often, but it was never moved, as if the weight of it helped keep the walls from remembering too much. The morning light came thin and cold through the shutters. The smell of damp ash clung to the hearth. The mother stood near the mantel, her hands folded before her. She hadn't touched the Bible in months. She told herself it was because the binding was too fragile, but she knew that wasn't the reason. Each time she glanced at it, she remembered her own mother's voice reciting verses that no longer sounded like comfort. Verses about punishment and reckoning, about sin that seeps through the generations like water through soil. The father sat at the table, his elbows resting on the wood, his coffee untouched. He'd returned from the field before sunrise, his boots caked in mud that didn't belong to any of their land. He hadn't spoken much since. The boy watched him from the corner of the room, waiting for a sign that the night's whispers had been nothing more than imagination. But the father's silence carried its own kind of confirmation. The boards beneath the hearth had stayed quiet through the morning. though every now and then the house let out a low creak that made the air shiver. The mother broke the silence. "It's Sunday," she said softly. "We'll read before the day gets on." The father nodded without lifting his eyes. The children gathered near the fire, their faces pale in the dim light. The mother reached for the Bible with slow hands. Her fingers brushed against the cracked leather, and she paused before lifting it. Dust drifted down as she brought it to the table and set it in front of her. The sound it made, a deep, heavy thump, seemed to echo through the floorboards. The youngest child startled at the noise. The father looked up. "Go on," he said. The mother opened the book carefully. The spine groaned like an old door. The pages resisted her touch at first, sticking together in the corners, as if the words inside weren't ready to be seen again. When she finally found the place she wanted, she began to read. Her voice was steady, low and measured. She read from the book of Job, a passage about trial and endurance, about faith tested beyond reason. The fire crackled softly beneath her words. The children listened in silence, though their eyes stayed fixed on the flicker of the flames instead of the open pages. The boy could hear the faint hiss of the fire blending with his mother's voice until the two sounds became one. When she reached the end of the passage, she stopped and closed the book halfway, her fingers still holding the place. The room seemed to lean into the pause. The father's voice broke it. "Your mother used to read that same verse," he said. The mother nodded. "She said it brought peace." The father's mouth tightened. "Did it?" Her gaze lowered. "It brought quiet." The father leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped loosely together. "Quiet's not the same thing." The boy looked between them, unsure if they were speaking to each other or to something else. The Bible sat between them on the table, like an uninvited guest. Its presence seemed to fill the room, heavy and waiting. The mother ran her fingers along the edge of the pages. The ink had faded in some places, and water stains spread across the margins like bruises. "When I was a girl," she said softly, "my father made us keep it open all night on All Hallows' Eve. He said it kept the dead from wandering too close." The eldest girl frowned. "Did it work?" The mother's smile was small and tired. "We still had the dead," she said, "but maybe they wandered a little farther from the door." The boy leaned forward. "What if it's not enough?" The mother closed the book. "It's never enough," she said quietly. The father stood and walked to the window. The light outside had grown strange, too bright in some places, too dim in others. The frost on the glass had begun to melt, forming slow rivulets that cut through the dust. "Ground's sinking more," he said, "by the porch and by the well." The mother rose. "It's that space beneath. You should have sealed it." He turned, his expression sharp. "Seal it with what? Words." Her voice lowered. "If that's what it takes." The eldest girl looked down at the floor. "It sounds like it's listening," she whispered. The boy heard it too, a faint creak beneath the boards, almost polite, as if in answer. The mother moved to the hearth and pressed her palm against the wood. "If the house remembers sin," she said, "then maybe the book remembers forgiveness." She lifted the Bible again and carried it to the center of the room. The family followed her with their eyes, silent and uncertain. She set the book on the floor, right above the spot where the whispers had come from the night before. The sound of leather against wood was soft, but it carried a strange finality. She knelt beside it, open to the same page, and began to read again, this time louder, her voice filling the corners of the room. The words fell heavy. The cadence was steady at first, then quicker, as if the verses were rising of their own accord. The children drew closer to the fire. The father remained by the window, watching the yard. The mother read until her voice began to tremble. Then she stopped. The silence that followed felt deeper than before. The boy waited for something, a creak, a breath, a sign that the whispering would return. But the floor stayed still. For a moment, it seemed the reading had calmed whatever waited below. The mother closed the Bible, keeping one hand pressed on the cover. Then came a sound. Not a whisper this time, but a single sharp crack from beneath the floorboards, like wood snapping under weight. The mother's head jerked up. The father turned from the window. The boy felt the vibration through his knees. Another crack followed, then a low dragging scrape that travelled from one side of the room to the other. The mother rose slowly, holding the Bible tight against her chest. "It's moving again," she said. The father stepped toward her. "Put it back." She didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the floor. The sound had changed now. It wasn't random anymore. It was a rhythm, slow and deliberate, like something being dragged. The eldest girl covered her ears. "Make it stop." The father crossed the room in 2 strides and took the book from the mother's hands. He carried it back to the mantel and set it down. The sound stopped immediately. The silence that followed felt almost warm in comparison. The father didn't move his hand from the cover. "It doesn't want it there," he said quietly. The mother's voice was barely a whisper. "Then where does it want it?" He didn't answer. He stood for a long moment, then stepped back and lowered himself into his chair. "Leave it," he said. "Let it sit where it sat." The mother didn't argue. She returned to the basin and began to wash the dishes again, though there was nothing left to clean. The eldest girl led the youngest to the bed and tucked her beneath the quilt. The boy sat near the hearth, staring at the dark line between 2 floorboards. The rest of the day passed in uneasy quiet. The father went outside again before dusk, saying he needed to check the fence line. The mother stayed near the fire, turning the pages of the Bible now and then, but never reading aloud. The children kept to themselves, whispering softly to each other as the light faded. When the father returned, his coat was damp and his boots caked with mud. He closed the door behind him and looked at the floor before meeting his wife's eyes. "The ground's opened near the porch," he said. "A hole deep enough you can't see the bottom." The mother's hand went to the Bible instinctively. "It's the same space," she said. "It's spreading." He nodded. "I'll board it tomorrow." That night, the family ate in silence. The stew tasted of smoke and iron. The youngest fell asleep before finishing her bowl. The mother carried her to bed, humming under her breath. The father sat at the table long after the dishes had been cleared, his hands resting on the wood, his gaze fixed on the mantel. The candle burned low. The flame bent eastward again, toward the pines. The boy lay awake on the cot beside his sister, his eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling. He could hear the faint sound of the wind outside, steady and calm. Then, just before sleep took him, another sound crept through the stillness, a soft rustle from the mantel, like pages turning themselves. He looked toward the Bible. Its cover was closed, but the air above it shimmered faintly, as if warmed by unseen breath. The mother stirred in her sleep, murmuring a prayer that slipped into silence. The father's eyes opened, reflecting the candlelight. Neither of them moved. The old book lay still, heavy and dark, its pages pressed tight together. Yet the boy could swear he heard something beneath it, faint and deliberate. A whisper, not from below the floor this time, but from within the paper itself, words too old to understand. A promise, or a warning, or both. Outside, the wind changed again, carrying the scent of wet soil from the field. The ground near the porch groaned softly. The night settled around the house, close and patient. And on the mantel, the Bible waited, heavy enough to keep its secrets for one more night. The lanterns were burning low by the time the sun dipped behind the pines, the faint light they gave stretching long shadows across the yard. Their glass panes had gone dark at the edges from smoke, and the pitch inside them had begun to harden, leaving behind a thin residue that smelled like earth and tar. The father stood by the fence, adjusting the wick of one while the boy held the next ready. The air had turned colder, and the fields beyond were covered in a dull silver haze that clung close to the ground, a kind of fog that didn't move even when the wind did. The mother watched from the porch, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The Bible sat open behind her on the table, the pages unmoving though the wind brushed through the cracks in the walls. The eldest girl sat beside it, shelling beans into a bowl, her eyes lifting toward the fields every few minutes, as though something there might look back. The youngest had fallen asleep on the floor, the doll clutched tight in her arms. Every now and then her lips moved as if whispering to it. The father turned the lantern slightly, checking the flame. "Pitch burns longer," he said to the boy. "Smells worse, but it lasts through the night." The boy nodded. The jar in his hand was warm to the touch, its metal top slick with sweat and soot. He could see his reflection in the curved glass, distorted, stretched thin, like a face seen through water. He set it on the fence post and watched his father light the wick. The small flame flared, then steadied. It gave off a faint hum, a sound too soft to be real, but too constant to ignore. "Fetch the others," the father said. "We'll line them to the bend." The boy gathered the remaining lanterns from the porch, one in each hand. The rest looped by their handles through a length of cord that swung against his leg as he walked. The fog thickened near the field's edge, its pale colour turning grey where it caught the lantern light. He set the jars along the fence at even distances, the way his father had taught him, so the glow would lead the eye but never merge into one unbroken line. Darkness, the father always said, needed to be reminded of its borders. When the last jar was lit, the boy stepped back. The flames trembled but held. From where he stood, they looked like a string of small eyes keeping watch over the field. He wiped his hands on his coat and turned toward the porch. The father was already walking back, his boots heavy in the dirt. The mother met them at the steps. "You'll waste the pitch if you light them this early," she said. "They'll burn through the night," the father answered. "It's better that way." She glanced toward the fence. "Better for who?" He didn't reply. He brushed past her and went inside, his boots leaving faint tracks of mud across the floorboards. The mother stayed on the porch a moment longer, her eyes on the farthest lantern. The fog there seemed to thicken, swallowing the light halfway. She couldn't tell if the flame was flickering or if something was standing between it and her. The boy waited until she turned away, then stepped down from the porch again. "I'll check the last one," he said, though he knew it didn't need checking. The mother didn't stop him. She watched him disappear into the grey haze, his shape swallowed by it before he reached the fence. The lantern at the bend burned weaker than the others. Its glass was cracked at one corner, a long line running from top to base. The boy knelt and tapped the metal rim. The sound was hollow. He lifted the jar, holding it close to his ear. Inside, the flame made a soft hiss, the pitch bubbling faintly at the bottom. He tightened the wick and waited for the light to strengthen, but it only grew smaller. He frowned. "Don't go out," he whispered. The words left his mouth like a breath in the cold air, hanging for a moment before fading. The flame shivered once, then steadied again, burning low but firm. The boy set the lantern back on the post and took a step away. As he turned, a faint sound reached him. A creak, long and dry, like wood bending under slow weight. It came from the direction of the trees, where the fog ended and the pines began. He held still. The sound came again, followed by another, shorter one. It wasn't wind. It wasn't animal. It was careful, deliberate. He picked up a small stick from the ground and threw it into the fog. It landed without a sound. The silence that followed was too clean, too neat, as if the air had swallowed the noise whole. Then something moved within the fog, just a shadow, quick and thin, slipping between the patches of light. The boy felt his stomach tighten. He stepped back slowly until the lanterns on either side of him lined his path like sentries. The flicker of their flames brushed across his coat as he moved, the rhythm of their light steady, almost heartbeat-like. By the time he reached the porch again, the fog had begun to lift in faint ribbons. The mother was still standing near the door. "It's burning," he said. She nodded. "Keep it that way." The father's voice came from inside. "Bring the rest in. Supper's cooling." The boy followed her into the house. The warmth inside felt strange, too sudden, almost unwelcome after the damp cold outside. The air was thick with the smell of stew and smoke. The Bible still sat open on the table, though no one had read from it since morning. The pages had shifted slightly, as if turned by an unseen hand. They ate in silence. The father's eyes stayed on the window. The mother's hand trembled once as she reached for the salt, then steadied again. The eldest girl glanced at her and said nothing. The youngest stirred in her sleep near the hearth, murmuring words that none of them recognized. When the meal was done, the father stood and went to the window. The lanterns along the fence were still visible, their flames small but bright enough to mark the line between yard and field. "They'll hold till dawn," he said. The mother joined him. "All but one," she said. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The one at the bend," she said. "It'll go out before the others." He studied her face. "You saw it?" "No," she said. "I felt it." The boy lowered his eyes. He wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. The image of that cracked lantern stayed in his mind. The faint sound of the creaking wood behind it. The way the fog had swallowed the stick he'd thrown. The father turned from the window. "I'll check it after we finish here." The mother shook her head. "Let it be. If it goes out, it goes out." He said nothing more. He sat by the fire and began cleaning his tools, wiping the dirt and oil from their handles. The sound of the cloth against metal was slow, steady, and unending. The boy watched the motion, hypnotic in its rhythm, and for a moment forgot the world outside. But when the wind shifted again, carrying the faint smell of pitch smoke through the cracks, he lifted his head. The scent was different now, thicker, almost sweet. He stood and went to the door. "I'll just look," he said. The father didn't stop him. The cold hit him the moment he stepped outside. The fog had thinned, but the air carried a damp heaviness that made each breath feel like pulling water. The lanterns along the fence still burned, but the one at the bend was dimmer now, its flame shrinking. He walked toward it, his boots crunching softly on the frost-hardened dirt. Halfway there, he stopped. A sound reached him, faint but close, like someone breathing behind the fog. He turned, expecting to see his father or sister, but the porch was empty. The flame in the nearest lantern bent sharply, its light stretching toward the field. He took another step. The cracked lantern at the bend flickered twice, then went dark. The sudden absence of light made the darkness between the lanterns look alive. The fog filled the gap, grey against black, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement again. Something low to the ground, crossing the fence line and disappearing into the rows of dead corn. The other lanterns held their light, trembling slightly, but refusing to go out. He approached the post where the dark lantern sat. The smell of pitch was strong now, sharp enough to sting his eyes. He lifted the jar, its side still warm. Inside, the wick glowed faintly, a dying ember. He reached for his flint, struck it once, then again. The spark caught, and the flame returned, weaker but steady. He turned toward the house. The window glowed faintly with firelight. The father's silhouette moved past it once, then vanished. The boy exhaled, a long, slow breath that hung white in the air. He set the lantern back on the post, checked the others, and began the walk home. By the time he reached the porch, the smell of pitch had settled into his clothes. The mother met him at the door. "It's burning again," he said. She nodded. "For now." He stepped inside. The warmth of the room felt different this time, heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. The father looked up from his chair. "All burning, all but one," the boy said. The father's brow furrowed. "Which one?" "The one at the bend." The father stood. "I'll see to it." The mother's voice stopped him. "Leave it. It's done its work." He paused, hand on the latch, then let it fall. "You think light has work?" "I think everything does," she said. He stared at her for a long moment before sitting again. The fire cracked softly. The Bible on the table shifted slightly in the draft, a single page curling upward. The boy noticed it first. He watched as the page turned itself halfway, the sound soft but unmistakable. The mother crossed the room and closed the book. "No more tonight," she said. The father nodded. "Let the lanterns burn." The family settled into quiet again. The eldest girl hummed softly, the sound blending with the hiss of the fire. The boy sat near the window, watching the faint glow of the fence line through the fog. The lights looked steady, small points of certainty in the darkness. But when the wind blew, he thought he saw them flicker, not from the breeze, but as if something large had passed between them just for a moment. He turned his eyes back to the room. The fire burned low. The candle on the mantel leaned eastward once more. The mother whispered a prayer, her voice low and steady. The father closed his eyes. Outside, the lanterns burned on. The one at the bend guttered again, its cracked glass glowing faintly, like an eye half open. The fog gathered thick around it, curling upward in shapes that refused to hold. The flame bent, straightened, then went out for good. The wind carried the smell of pitch through the yard and under the door. Inside the house, the air stirred, and the boards gave a single low sigh. The boy looked toward the hearth, his heart beating slow but strong. He didn't say anything. No one did. The light that remained flickered against the walls, casting long shadows that reached toward the floor. And somewhere beyond the fence, in the darkness between the lanterns, something began to move again. The fog had begun to thin by morning, but it left behind a dampness that clung to everything. The walls, the windows, the clothes hanging on the pegs. The smell of pitch lingered in the air like old smoke. The mother was the first to notice the tracks near the fence, deep impressions in the wet soil that hadn't been there the night before. They started where the last lantern had burned out and ran in a slow curve along the rails before vanishing into the field. She stood for a long time staring at them, her breath visible in the cold air, her hands tightening around the shawl at her shoulders. When the father joined her, she didn't speak. She just pointed. The prints were long, narrow, and spaced too evenly to be from any animal. The father knelt beside the first one and pressed his fingers into the edge. The ground there was soft, but the imprint was deep enough that his fingertips couldn't reach the bottom. The mud around it had dried in thin cracks overnight, leaving behind a faint ring of frost. He rose slowly, his gaze following the direction the tracks had taken, straight toward the line of pines that bordered the far side of the field. The boy stood a few feet away, holding his coat closed with one hand. "Someone was here," he said. The father nodded once. "Not someone from town." The mother's voice was quiet but sharp. "No one from town walks here after sundown." The wind moved through the cornstalks, dry and whispering. The sound filled the space between them like a low murmur. The father adjusted the strap of his coat and began following the prints along the fence. The boy trailed behind him, keeping a few steps back. The mother didn't move from the porch, but she watched until they disappeared into the grey light. The prints led to the corner of the fence where the rails met in a crossbeam. One of the boards there had been shifted, its end lifted slightly as if something heavy had pressed against it from the other side. The father crouched, examining the joint. "Wasn't wind," he said. The boy stared past the fence. The field beyond was covered in a thin layer of frost that glittered faintly in the weak sunlight. The tracks stopped just before the fence, but the grass on the other side looked pressed down, flattened in a straight line leading toward the woods. "It crossed," the boy said. "Or it tried to," the father answered. "Fence might have held." The boy frowned. "Held what?" The father didn't answer. He stood and turned back toward the house. "We'll stay close tonight," he said. They walked back in silence. The boy glanced once over his shoulder and thought he saw movement at the edge of the trees, just a flicker, a darker patch of shadow sliding behind one of the trunks. He stopped, squinting, but when he looked again, the space was empty. Only the fog moving slowly between the branches. Inside, the fire had burned down again. The mother was at the table, her hands resting on the closed Bible. She didn't look up when they entered. "It followed the fence?" she asked. The father nodded. "Stopped near the corner, might have gone back." The mother's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the book. "Might have stayed," she said. The boy sat by the hearth and held his hands to the faint heat. His fingers still smelled of the pitch from the night before. The eldest girl stood near the window, her breath clouding the glass as she leaned forward to see outside. "The lanterns are still there," she said. "All but the one at the bend. Leave them," the father said. "Don't touch what's working." The girl nodded, but didn't move away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the fence line, scanning the pale shapes of the jars. For a while, the house was quiet, except for the soft sound of the fire and the ticking of the clock above the mantel. Then the boy spoke. "If someone was out there," he said, "why didn't they knock?" The father didn't look at him. "Because they weren't looking for a door." The mother turned sharply. "Don't say that." He met her gaze. "You think I don't know what this is? It's the same as it was when my father lived here. Same as the year the well ran dry and the ground opened by the barn. Same smell, same air." Her voice lowered. "That was before the war. Things were different. Not different enough," he said. "Not here." The boy listened, not understanding everything but feeling the weight of what wasn't said. He thought of the cracked lantern, the way the fog had moved, the shape he might have seen near the trees. "You think it's a man?" he asked. The father's jaw tightened. "Once," he said. The mother turned away. "We'll pray tonight." When dusk came, the fog returned with it. The air grew colder than the night before, sharp enough to sting the skin. The father went out again to check the lanterns, his coat collar pulled high. The boy followed without being told. The light from the house faded quickly behind them, swallowed by the mist. At the fence, the lantern still burned, though their flames were dim. The air around them shimmered faintly, as if the glass itself held heat. The father moved from post to post, checking each wick, tightening one here, adding oil to another. When he reached the corner where the prints had stopped, he paused. The board that had been shifted earlier was now lying flat, perfectly aligned with the others. The ground beneath it looked undisturbed. The boy noticed it too. "You fixed it?" The father shook his head. "Didn't touch it." They stood in silence, both of them staring at the same spot. The fog moved around them in slow, curling waves. Somewhere deep in the field, a sound echoed, a faint metallic clatter, like a chain being dragged across stone. The father turned his head toward it, but didn't move. "We'll go back," he said finally. As they walked toward the house, the boy glanced over his shoulder. The fog had thickened again, hiding most of the fence. Only the nearest lanterns were still visible, their flames swaying in the wind. But in the space between them, something stood. It wasn't a shadow, not quite. It had the shape of a man, tall, still, shoulders squared. The fog curled around it but didn't pass through. The boy froze. "Father," he whispered. The man turned, following his gaze. His breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't move. It stood just beyond the fence, where the ground dipped toward the field. For a long moment, it might have been nothing more than a trick of light and fog. Then it shifted slightly, its head tilting to one side, a slow, deliberate motion. The father's voice was low. "Go inside." The boy hesitated. "What is it?" "Go," he said again, sharper this time. The boy obeyed. He ran toward the porch, his boots pounding against the frozen ground. The door opened before he reached it. The mother stood there, her face pale. "What is it?" she asked. "Someone at the fence," the boy said. Her eyes widened. "A man." He nodded. "Father's still out there." She stepped onto the porch, the cold biting at her bare feet. The fog stretched across the yard, dull and shifting, the light from the lanterns flickering at its edge. She could see the father's shape moving slowly toward the house. Behind him, the fog grew darker, gathering like storm clouds. He climbed the steps and shut the door behind him without a word. His coat was damp with frost, and his hands trembled slightly as he unbuttoned it. "What did you see?" the mother asked. He sat by the fire, rubbing warmth back into his fingers. "A man," he said. "From town?" "No." "Then who?" He didn't look up, didn't recognize him, didn't move, just stood there watching. The room went quiet. The eldest girl pulled the youngest closer, wrapping a blanket around them both. The mother crossed herself, whispering under her breath. The father leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "We'll keep the lanterns burning," he said, "and we won't go near the fence again." The boy spoke softly. "Will he come closer?" The father's eyes met his. "Not if he remembers what keeps him out." The mother turned toward the mantel. The Bible lay closed, its spine facing the fire. "And if he doesn't?" The father didn't answer. He reached for the poker and stirred the coals. Sparks rose and died in the chimney. The boy watched him, his heart pounding in slow, steady beats. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, thick as breath. The lanterns flickered once, twice, then steadied. The air inside grew warmer, but it felt like the warmth of something trapped. As the night deepened, the family settled into uneasy silence. The fire burned low, the only light beside the faint glow from the lanterns beyond the fence. Every so often, the wind shifted, and the fog thinned enough for the boy to see the fence line through the window. Each time he looked, the lanterns were still there, but between two of them, where the shadow had stood, the space looked darker than before, as if the night itself had decided to stay. When the father rose at last and bolted the door, no one spoke. The latch fell with a heavy sound that echoed through the house. The boy lay awake long after the others had fallen silent. Somewhere beyond the walls, faint but certain, he heard it again. The slow drag of feet along the fence, the creak of wood under weight, the long pause before another step. He turned toward the window, but didn't move the curtain. He knew what he would see: the faint outline of the fence, the glow of the lanterns, and between them, the shape of a man standing perfectly still, waiting for something only the dark could name. The night passed without sleep. The wind rose and fell in waves, brushing against the walls like a hand searching for a way in. The father sat near the fire, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the door. The others lay where they had fallen asleep, wrapped in blankets that smelled of wood smoke and cold air. The house itself seemed to breathe with them, expanding slightly as the wind pressed, settling again when it passed. The sound of the lanterns outside came faintly through the glass, a low hum carried on the air whenever the fog parted just enough. By dawn, the fire had burned low, leaving only a red pulse of coals. The father rose, stretched his back, and went to the window. The fog was gone. The fields were clear for the first time in days, the frost on the grass glinting under the thin grey light. Every lantern still stood, each one dark now, the glass blackened by soot. Beyond the fence, the ground lay undisturbed, no new prints, no movement, just the emptiness of morning after a long night that had refused to end. The mother stirred beside the hearth. She sat up slowly, blinking against the light. "Is it gone?" she asked. "For now," the father said. She rose and went to the window. The sight of the empty field made her shiver. "You saw him." He nodded. He didn't move, not once, just watched. She crossed herself and whispered something under her breath. The boy, half awake, caught only fragments, words about mercy and remembrance, words that sounded more like habit than hope. The eldest girl wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and began clearing the table from the night before. The youngest still slept, her hand resting on the doll's hair, her mouth slightly open as if in mid-prayer. The father went outside to gather the lanterns. The door shut behind him with a sound that echoed through the stillness. The boy followed a few minutes later, careful to keep distance between them. The air was colder than it looked, the frost biting through the leather of his shoes. Each lantern was crusted with soot, their glass cold to the touch. The father worked without speaking, lifting them one by one and setting them in a row near the steps. The boy noticed his hands shaking slightly, though his face gave nothing away. When they reached the corner where the cracked lantern had gone out first, the boy saw that the ground there had sunk a little, as if something heavy had pressed down from below. The soil was frozen on top, but darker patches showed beneath where the frost hadn't reached. The father stared at it for a long time before speaking. "We'll fill it later," he said. The boy nodded. "Do you think he'll come back?" His father didn't look at him. He never left. They brought the lanterns inside, one after another, setting them near the hearth to dry. The mother said nothing, though her eyes followed each jar as if counting them. The house smelled of pitch again, faint but sharp, clinging to the walls. The father scrubbed the soot from his hands and sat at the table. "We'll wait till noon," he said. "If it stays clear, I'll patch the fence." The mother nodded. "And if it doesn't? Then we keep the fire going." She didn't argue. The boy noticed the way her hands lingered on the Bible, tracing the edges of its cover without opening it. The morning stretched on quietly. The air inside felt heavy, the kind of weight that made each sound louder than it should be. When the wind moved through the chimney, it sounded like voices whispering just beyond reach. The eldest girl hummed under her breath as she swept the floor, but the tune faltered when the broom scraped across a soft spot in the boards near the hearth. The mother turned sharply at the sound, but the girl only nodded and moved on. By afternoon, the light outside had turned flat and grey. The father went back to the fence with a length of rope and a hammer. The boy followed, though the ground seemed different underfoot now, softer, looser, as if the earth itself were breathing beneath the frost. They worked in silence. When they finished, the father stood still for a long time, looking toward the woods. "He won't knock," he said suddenly. The boy frowned. "What?" The father didn't turn. Men who carry their sins that far don't need to knock. They've already been inside. The boy didn't understand, not completely, but he knew better than to ask. The air around them felt thick, the kind of stillness that comes before something moves. They turned back toward the house. That night, the wind came from the east. It carried with it a sound like distant bells, though there were no churches near enough for the echo to reach. The fire burned high, but the warmth didn't settle. The mother kept glancing at the door, her lips moving silently in prayer. The father sat near the window, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the yard. When the clock above the mantel struck 10, the sound of the chime seemed to stretch, the last note hanging in the air longer than it should have. The mother looked up. "It's too quiet," she said. The father didn't answer. His eyes were still on the window. The boy followed his gaze, but saw only his own reflection in the glass, pale and uncertain. The fog had begun to return, crawling low along the ground like smoke. The fence was barely visible now. The lantern posts nothing more than darker shapes against grey. The wind shifted again. The candle flame bent sharply toward the door, then steadied. The father stood. "He's near," he said. The room went still. Even the fire seemed to lower its breath. The mother's voice was a whisper. "You said he wouldn't come." "I said he wouldn't knock," the father said. "That's not the same." A faint sound echoed through the yard, soft, rhythmic, almost gentle. Not a knock, but close. It came from the far side of the fence, a dull thud against wood, 3 times in slow succession. Then nothing. The youngest stirred in her sleep. "Someone's at the door," she murmured. The mother reached for her. "No one's at the door, baby." But the boy heard it too. Not knocking, not exactly. It was the sound of the air itself pressing against the walls, as if the night were testing their strength. The boards under the window creaked, a long, slow groan. The father crossed the room and stood by the door, his hand on the latch, but not lifting it. "Stay where you are," he said. The sound came again, this time from the side of the house, not loud, more like something brushing against the boards. Then a faint scraping, like fingers tracing the outline of the wall. The mother began to whisper a prayer, the words spilling from her quickly, without pause. The eldest girl joined her, her voice trembling, but steady enough to hold the rhythm. The father turned from the door and looked toward the hearth. "Keep reading," he said. The mother hesitated. "What?" "The Bible," he said. "Read from it. The words keep it back." She opened the book to the same passage as before, the one about trials and endurance. Her voice was low at first, but it grew stronger as she read. The scraping outside slowed, then stopped altogether. The house seemed to exhale. Then came a new sound, faint, high, almost like a whistle. It came from the chimney. The fire dimmed for a moment, the flame bending inward, as though something above it had drawn the air away. The mother's voice faltered, then steadied again. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow," the whistle grew louder, a sharp, keening note that made the boy cover his ears. The father grabbed the poker and stirred the coals, sending up a burst of sparks. The sound cut off abruptly, leaving only the crackle of the fire. Silence returned, thick and close. The father looked toward the door once more. "He's not coming in," he said. The mother closed the Bible. "Then why is he here?" The father didn't answer. He set the poker aside and sat down again. The wind outside had changed direction, moving now from the north. Each gust carried a low vibration that travelled through the walls and into the floor, like the heartbeat of something buried deep. The boy lay down beside the hearth, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Every so often he thought he heard footsteps on the porch, but when he held his breath to listen, the sound faded. The candle near the mantel burned lower, its wick curling. The last light from the fire flickered across the father's face, carving deep shadows beneath his eyes. When sleep finally came, it was thin and shallow. The boy dreamed of the fence lines stretching into the fog, of lanterns that burned without flame, of a figure standing beyond them, silent and waiting. In the dream the sound came again, not knocking, not quite, but something softer, the air against the door, the whisper of fingers on wood, a sound that carried not threat, but patience. When he woke, the room was still dark. The fire had gone cold. The others slept. Only the candle on the mantel still burned, its flame small and trembling. The boy listened, his heart slowing to match the rhythm of the night. No knocking, no scraping. Just the sound of the wind breathing against the walls, the quiet promise of something that had all the time in the world to wait. By morning, the air in the house had grown thick with the smell of smoke. The fire had burned down to ash, leaving faint white mounds on the hearth that glowed weakly when stirred. The father crouched beside it, turning the blackened logs with the poker until a few red sparks flared, then dimmed again. The light that came through the shutters was weak and grey, the kind that didn't bring warmth or day with it, only visibility. The mother stood near the window, her hands resting on the sill, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the fence. The boy sat at the table with a cup of milk that had gone cold. He hadn't spoken since waking, and no one had asked him to. The house felt quiet in a new way, different from the hush that came after night sounds faded. This silence was heavy, like something filling the space rather than leaving it empty. Even the floorboards seemed to have stopped their restless shifting. The only sound was the soft crumble of ash as the father stirred the coals again. The eldest girl sat on the floor brushing her sister's hair, the strokes slow and careful. The youngest hummed to herself, the doll in her lap. The tune was uneven, more murmured than sung, and every few breaths she paused as if listening to something no one else could hear. When she finally looked up, her eyes were glassy and distant. "The man's gone," she said. The father didn't look up from the hearth. "You saw him?" She shook her head. "No, but he was at the door last night. I heard him breathing." The mother turned sharply. "He never knocked." The girl looked back at the doll. He didn't need to. The room went still. The mother crossed the floor and knelt beside her, touching her shoulder lightly. "You had a bad dream," she said. The girl's fingers tightened on the doll's arm. "He said he's waiting." The father rose slowly, setting the poker aside. "That's enough talk," he said. "We've got work to do." He went to the door, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside. The cold met him like a wall, sharp and dry. Frost had formed on the steps, thin as breath. The yard looked smaller in daylight, the fence closer, the ground flatter. But the air felt strange, thick in his lungs, like something unseen, pressing back with each breath. He walked to the porch's edge and looked down. The patch of ground that had sunk near the house was deeper now, a small hollow with its edges soft and damp, as though it had been recently disturbed. The frost hadn't settled there, though it covered the rest of the yard. He crouched, pressing a hand against the dirt. It was warm. When he returned inside, he carried the smell of cold earth with him. The mother looked up. "It's spreading again," he said. She didn't ask how he knew. "The ground by the well?" "Not yet," he said, "but it will." The mother turned back to the window. The glass was fogged from her breath, a thin mist that hid the field beyond. "We'll do what my mother did," she said finally, "when the house feels touched." The father frowned. "That won't help." "It kept her house standing," she said. He sighed but didn't argue. He knew the ritual she meant. One passed down like a secret, never written, never spoken of in daylight. He'd watched her do it once years ago, when the youngest had fallen ill, and the sound of scratching under the house had woken them every night for a week. It had quieted then, though whether from faith or chance, he couldn't say. The mother went to the mantel and took down the small tin box that held what remained of the last ashes from her own mother's hearth. She opened it carefully, as if afraid the faintest shake might undo its power. The ash inside was pale grey, with flecks of white bone mixed through it. She knelt before the fire and spooned a small handful into her palm. "It has to be done before night," she said. The boy watched her. "What do you do with it?" She didn't answer right away. "You mark the thresholds," she said at last. "Every doorway, every window, every place where the world touches ours." The eldest girl helped her gather what was needed: an old broom handle, a basin of water, a strip of linen. The boy followed them silently, the weight of the air pressing closer as they moved through the house. The mother dipped the linen into the water, then into the ash, and traced a small line across the top of each window. The mark was faint, almost invisible in the grey light, but it left a smell behind, dry and sharp, like burned cedar. At the door, she paused. "This one last," she said. The father stood beside her. "It won't stop him if he means to come." "It's not for him," she said. "It's for us." She dipped the cloth again and drew a slow, deliberate line across the top of the door frame. The ash clung to the grain of the wood, falling in small flakes that drifted to the floor. When she finished, she pressed a hand flat against the mark. "Let the house keep what's inside," she whispered, "and let what's outside stay wanting." The boy felt a shiver run through him. The air seemed to change with the words, thickening like water disturbed. The faint sound of the wind outside faded, replaced by something heavier, the silence of expectation. The mother straightened and handed the cloth to her eldest. "Take what's left and mark the hearth," she said, "where the heat begins." The girl hesitated. "And if it's already there?" "Then it'll show itself," the mother said. The eldest knelt by the fire and began to trace the line across the bricks. The ash clung to the rough surface, catching in the cracks. When she finished, she sat back on her heels. "It's done." The father nodded once. "Then we wait." They didn't speak for the rest of the morning. The house felt sealed, every door and window marked, every sound caught in the heavy air. Even the fire seemed quieter, burning low but steady. The boy sat near the hearth, staring at the grey line that ran along its edge. The ash shimmered faintly in the light, though there was no reason it should. By afternoon, the air grew colder still. The frost outside began to melt, not from sunlight, but from something in the ground itself. Water pooled along the edges of the fence, dark and slow-moving. The father went out once to look, but he didn't cross the yard. He came back with his boots wet and his jaw set tight. "The ground's bleeding," he said. The mother didn't ask what he meant. She added more wood to the fire and stirred the pot on the hearth. The stew simmered, thick and slow. The smell of sage and salt filled the room, masking the sharper scent of ash. When night came, it fell fast. The fog returned, heavier than before, pressing against the windows like cloth soaked through. The lanterns were not lit this time. The father said there was no point. The light, he said, only showed what they couldn't stop. The family gathered near the hearth. The youngest sat in her mother's lap, the doll resting beside her. The eldest sat close by, her hands folded. The boy sat nearest the fire, watching the flames bend and sway with each breath of wind that found its way down the chimney. The first sound came just after the clock struck 9, a faint tapping, not at the door, but somewhere within the walls. It moved slowly, from one end of the room to the other, like footsteps behind plaster. The boy's head turned with it, his breath catching. The father didn't move. The mother whispered another prayer, her voice trembling slightly now. The tapping stopped. Then came a new sound, a soft, steady hiss, like water poured onto hot coals. The fire sputtered once, twice, then flared. The ash on the hearth began to shift. At first it moved like dust caught in a draft. Then it gathered, pulling toward the center of the hearth, forming small ridges that rose and fell like breathing. The mother reached for the Bible, but before she could open it, the ash stilled again. The father leaned forward. "It's testing the marks," he said quietly. The mother's voice was thin. "And if they hold? Then it'll wait," he said. Just like before. The boy's eyes stayed fixed on the hearth. The faint shimmer he'd seen earlier returned, brighter now, as if light were bleeding up through the ashes instead of down from the fire. For a moment, he thought he saw shapes forming there, hands, faces, or something between the two. But when he blinked, the glow vanished. Only the grey dust remained. They stayed there long after midnight, the fire burning low, the air too heavy for speech. Every few minutes the wind would shift, and the ashes would stir, whispering against the brick like dry leaves. Each time, the mother's hand tightened on the Bible. Each time, the father said nothing. When dawn finally came, it brought no colour, only a thin, colourless light that seeped through the cracks in the shutters. The ashes on the hearth were still. The marks on the windows had faded, and the air smelled faintly of damp soil. The mother stood first. She crossed the room, her movements slow, as though listening for something. Then she said, "It's not gone." The father looked up from his chair. "No," he said, "it's only resting." The boy watched the last ember die, its glow swallowed by the grey. The hearth looked cold now, lifeless. But as the wind pressed once more against the walls, a thin wisp of ash lifted from the centre and drifted upward, curling through the air like smoke from a fire still burning somewhere unseen. The frost never melted that day. It clung to the windows like thin veins of glass, tracing its way up the panes until even the sunlight could barely find a path through. The mother said the air felt wrong, too still, too heavy. The father said it was only winter, setting in early, but the words didn't carry conviction. They both knew this kind of stillness didn't belong to any season. It was the kind that came when the world itself was waiting for something to move first. By afternoon, the clouds thickened, a flat, unbroken grey that hung low over the fields. The wind had died entirely. Even the pines beyond the fence stood silent, their branches unmoving. The eldest girl said she could hear a sound in that silence, a kind of humming, too faint to be from the earth, but too steady to come from the air. The mother told her to stop listening for things that weren't there, but she heard it too. The sound came and went like breath. The father worked outside until the light began to fade, patching the fence and clearing the ditch where the water from the well had started pooling. The ground there had grown soft again, dark mud glistening beneath the frost. Each step left a deep mark that filled slowly with water. When he reached the far edge of the field, he stopped. The earth fell away slightly there, where the creek widened and twisted down toward the swamp. The smell of it rose thick in the cold air. Rot and moss and stagnant water that hadn't moved since the last good rain. He stood for a while, watching the thin film of ice that had formed across its surface. It looked solid until the wind touched it, and then it trembled like skin. He turned to head back toward the house, and that was when he heard it. A bell. Faint at first, carried on the air so softly it might have been mistaken for the groan of a branch in the cold. But it came again, clear, distinct, the sound of a single church bell ringing from somewhere far across the swamp. He stopped walking. There hadn't been a church in that direction for as long as anyone could remember. The nearest stood 5 miles north, and its bell had been silent for years, the steeple long fallen in on itself. But the sound carried all the same. 3 slow tolls, then silence. The father stood still until the echo faded. The wind didn't return afterward. The swamp went quiet again, so quiet that the only sound was the soft creak of the frozen reeds rubbing against each other. He turned back toward the house, walking faster now, his boots breaking through the thin crust of frost with each step. When he came through the door, the mother looked up. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He hung his coat by the door, his hands shaking slightly from the cold. "You ever hear a bell from the swamp?" he asked finally. The mother's face drained of colour. "Not for a long time," she said. The boy lifted his head from where he sat near the fire. "There's no church there," he said. The father nodded. "Not anymore." The eldest girl's voice was quiet. "Grandmother said the bell rang when the ground was disturbed, when someone was taken who shouldn't have been." The mother's eyes darted toward her. "Enough." But the father's gaze didn't leave the window. "Your grandmother wasn't wrong," he said. "The church sank years before you were born. The swamp took it. My father said you could still hear the bell some nights, when the ground shifted. The youngest stirred on the floor, rubbing her eyes. "What's it ringing for now?" she asked sleepily. The father didn't answer. He sat by the fire, his hands stretched toward the faint heat. The smell of the swamp seemed to follow him in, damp and heavy, like soil after rain. As the evening came on, the air outside grew darker than it should have been for that hour. The fog rose early, curling low around the fence. The family ate in silence, the sound of their spoons on the bowls, the only rhythm in the room. When they were done, the father rose and went to the door. He opened it just enough to see the field. The fog moved like water, slow and restless. The faintest hint of the swamp's scent drifted through the opening. He shut the door again and bolted it. "It's closer tonight," he said. The mother didn't ask what he meant. She took the Bible from the mantel and set it on the table, though she didn't open it. The eldest girl began to hum softly, the same tune she'd used to soothe the youngest on restless nights. It didn't sound like a hymn this time. It was slower, lower, more like a sound the house itself might make. The clock struck 9. The sound echoed longer than usual, each chime stretching as though reluctant to fade. When the last one fell silent, the air inside the house thickened. The fire dimmed for a moment, then flared again, and then the bell rang. Not faint this time, not distant, clear, deep. The kind of sound that belonged to iron struck by something stronger than wind. The father froze. The mother's hand went to her chest. The boy's spoon slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a dull clang. The bell rang again. One toll, then another. The sound rolled through the air and into the walls, making the glass in the windows tremble. It didn't echo this time. It stayed, stretching out, vibrating in the boards beneath their feet. The father stood and went to the window, though he didn't look out right away. "It's moving," he said. The mother's voice shook. "The sound." He nodded. "It's closer." Another toll came, louder this time. The boy felt it in his chest, a low, heavy thud that made the air vibrate in his lungs. The fire sputtered again, then steadied, its flame bending westward. The eldest girl whispered, "It's calling something." The mother silenced her with a look, but the words hung in the air. The bell rang again, so close now it might have been in the yard. The boy stood and went to the door. The father reached for him, but stopped short. "Don't open it," he said. "I just want to listen," the boy said. "You don't listen to things that shouldn't sound," the father replied. The next toll came, longer than the rest. The floor vibrated, dust fell from the rafters. Somewhere outside, the fence groaned, the rails creaking like something pressing against them. The father took a step toward the window and lifted the curtain. The fog glowed faintly in the distance, pale and shifting. He couldn't see far, but he could tell something was moving within it. Not fast, but steady. The bell tolled once more, and the fog pulsed with light, faint, golden, the colour of rusted metal. The mother clutched the Bible to her chest. "It's not a bell," she said softly. "It's the ground." The father turned to her. "What?" "When the church sank," she said. "They said the bell stayed above the water for days. Then one morning it was gone. My mother said the ground took it whole, but it still rang when something stirred what was buried with it." The father didn't answer. The bell rang again, closer still, though the sound no longer seemed to come from one direction. It was everywhere, above, below, inside the walls. The boy pressed his hands to his ears, but it didn't help. The vibration moved through him, steady and cold. He could feel it beneath the floor, a rhythm that wasn't the same as his heartbeat, but close enough to confuse it. Then, As suddenly as it had begun, the bell fell silent. The fog outside stopped moving. The house seemed to hold its breath. The mother lowered the Bible slowly. "It's waiting," she said. The father moved away from the window. His voice was low, certain. "No, it's listening." The silence that followed was worse than the sound. The air didn't feel still. It felt occupied, as if something unseen had entered with the ringing and refused to leave. The fire flickered weakly, then went out entirely, leaving only the faint glow of embers. The mother struck a match and lit a candle. The small flame trembled. "It's not finished," she said. The father stared at the window. "Nothing ever is." The boy lay down near the hearth, watching the thin curl of smoke rising from the dead fire. It twisted and coiled before vanishing into the chimney, but the smell of the swamp stayed behind. Damp, sour, heavy. He could almost hear water moving somewhere beneath the floorboards, slow and steady, though he knew it couldn't be real. When sleep came, it brought no rest. He dreamed of the swamp spreading wider, swallowing the fence and the fields, the fog glowing with each toll of the unseen bell. He saw the church, its steeple bent and sinking, the rope still swinging where the ringer should have stood. And through it all, he heard the same voice that had whispered from the floorboards nights ago, soft and deliberate. "The bell rang for the living," it said. The ground rang for the rest. He woke before dawn, the echo still in his ears. The candle had burned down to nothing. The house was dark again, the air thick and unmoving. The first light of morning crept through the shutters, pale and grey, casting faint lines across the walls. The father was still awake, sitting by the window, his face drawn and hollow. The mother slept in her chair, the Bible open across her lap. The boy rose quietly and joined him. "Did you hear it again?" he asked. The father shook his head. "No, not yet." They sat in silence for a while. Then the boy spoke. "What happens when it stops for good?" The father's eyes stayed on the field. "Then we find out who it was ringing for." The boy looked out through the thin slit of light between the shutters. The fog still hung low over the ground, unmoving. But in its centre, far beyond the fence, he thought he saw something glint, a small, dull reflection, swinging slightly back and forth, like metal, like a bell, still waiting to ring again. The first frost of the new week settled so thick on the windows that by morning, the light in the house had turned to a dim silver haze. The air carried the weight of smoke and damp wood, the scent of the swamp still clinging to every wall. The father didn't light the lanterns that night. He said they didn't need them anymore. But the boy could tell it wasn't certainty in his voice, just exhaustion. The kind that comes when a man runs out of things to believe will keep him safe. The mirror had been covered for years. It hung on the wall opposite the hearth, draped in a length of black cloth that had faded to brown at the edges. No one ever touched it, not even when cleaning. The mother said it was a mourning veil, though no one could remember who it had first been for. The fabric itself was older than the youngest child, maybe older than the house. The father had once said it belonged to his grandmother, who kept it hung over her looking glass after her first son drowned in the river. She said it wasn't meant to hide her face, but to keep his reflection from coming back. That morning, the boy found the cloth folded halfway down. The pins that held it in place had come loose sometime in the night, though the windows were still latched and the door still barred. The mirror beneath it caught the faint light from the fire and turned it into a dull gleam, enough to show the faint outline of the room behind him. The surface wasn't clean. It was speckled with dark spots where the silver had worn through, giving the reflection a patchwork of light and shadow. Still, it felt alive. He stood there a long time, watching the flicker of the fire in the glass. Then, just as he turned to leave, the flame in the hearth bent sideways, east, toward the pines again. The reflection bent with it. But the movement that followed didn't belong to the fire. It came from deeper in the mirror, somewhere behind the boy's reflection. A shape shifted, slow, dark, human, but gone before he could focus on it. He stepped back, his breath fogging the surface. For a moment, it looked like the fog came from inside the glass, not from him. He called for his mother. She came quickly, her shawl drawn close, her expression tight. When she saw the half-uncovered mirror, she froze. "Don't look," she said, crossing the room. "It was already like that," the boy said. "I didn't touch it." She pressed the cloth back into place, her fingers trembling as she pinned it again. The metal pin snapped in her hand. She took another from her apron and fixed it tighter. "It doesn't matter who touched it," she said softly. "It just matters that it was open." The father came in from outside, his boots tracking frost across the floor. "What's wrong?" "The veil slipped," she said. He stopped mid-step. "How?" She shook her head. "There's no wind." He looked at the mirror, now hidden again, and then at his wife. "We'll move it." She turned sharply. "No, it stays where it is." He frowned. "It's been here too long. That's why it stays," she said. The father didn't argue. He stood by the fire for a long time, rubbing warmth back into his hands. The boy noticed he wouldn't turn his back toward the mirror. All that day, the mother worked in silence, humming softly to herself as she moved from room to room. Her tune wasn't familiar, slow, uneven, half a lullaby, half a prayer. She sprinkled ash at the corners of the doorways again, though she said the last marking should have been enough. The eldest helped her, but she didn't ask questions this time. The father went out to the field and didn't return until after sunset. When he came back, he brought with him something wrapped in burlap. He set it by the hearth without a word. The mother waited until the children had gone to bed before unwrapping it. Inside was a small mirror, hand-held, its silver backing cracked and peeling. "Where did you find it?" she asked quietly. "In the field," he said, "half buried near the fence." Her face went pale. "You should have left it." "I thought it might have been ours once," he said. "Looks old enough." "It's not ours," she said. He didn't answer. He picked it up, turned it in the light, and studied his reflection, or what was left of it. The glass caught the firelight, but gave back something dimmer, darker. The lines of his face looked heavier, as if the years had deepened in the seconds he looked. He set it down quickly. "It's warped," he said. The mother covered it with the same burlap again and pushed it beneath the hearth. "Nothing comes out of that soil clean," she said. That night, no one slept easily. The wind had gone still again, and the air pressed close to the walls, as if listening. The fire burned low, its light flickering weakly against the draped mirror. Every so often, the cloth stirred slightly, though no air moved. The boy lay awake on his cot, watching the shadow of it. He could see the faint outline of the frame beneath the veil, its edges catching just enough light to make it look like a doorway. The longer he watched, the more it seemed to pulse, as though something on the other side were breathing. At some point near midnight, the faint sound of metal struck the air, the soft clink of a pin falling to the floor. He sat up slowly. The others were still asleep. The cloth on the mirror had loosened again. one corner drooping just enough to show a sliver of glass. He wanted to wake his mother, but his voice wouldn't come. He stood instead, bare feet cold against the wood. The room was nearly dark now, only the dull red of the coals giving shape to the walls. He stepped closer to the mirror. The reflection was faint, but there, the hearth, the coals, the empty chairs, his own outline, blurred and pale. Then, behind him, movement. A second outline, taller, thinner, standing where the firelight didn't reach. He turned fast, but the space behind him was empty. When he looked back, the shape in the mirror hadn't moved. It didn't feel like watching. It felt like waiting. The father stirred then, waking with a quiet start. The boy stepped back as he rose and looked around the room. "What are you doing up?" he asked. "The cloth," the boy said. "It's loose again." The father crossed the room, his steps heavy and slow. He saw the fallen pin glinting near the baseboard and bent to pick it up. The metal was cold enough to sting his fingers. He pinned the veil back into place, pressing the cloth tight. "Go back to bed," he said. The boy hesitated. There was something in it. The father's hand stopped mid-motion. He looked at the mirror, his jaw tightening. "There's always something in it," he said. He sat by the fire until dawn. The boy fell asleep near the hearth, the warmth of the coals fading under him. When morning came, the father was still there, his eyes red from wakefulness, the poker clenched loosely in one hand. The mirror remained covered, the pins holding firm. At breakfast, no one spoke of it. The mother set bread and milk on the table, her movements slow, deliberate. The eldest girl's face was pale, her hands trembling slightly. "It's showing through," she said quietly. "What is?" the mother asked. "The cloth. You can see through it now." The father turned toward the wall. The fabric over the mirror had thinned in places, the light from the window catching faintly behind it, showing the dull outline of the glass beneath. "We'll take it down," he said. The mother shook her head. "You can't take it down. Then we'll cover it again." "No," she said. "We'll bury it." That night, after the children had gone to bed, they took the mirror down together. The father lifted it from the wall, holding it by its edges. For a moment, his reflection and the mother's stood side by side in the glass. Then, as they turned toward the door, the reflections didn't move. They froze mid-step. The air in the room grew sharp. The father didn't look back. "Don't see it," he said. The mother's breath came fast and shallow. "I already do." They carried it outside. The frost cracked beneath their boots, the night air thick and soundless. The fog hadn't returned, but the world still felt blurred at its edges, as if the darkness had no end. They dug a shallow hole behind the house, where the ash from the hearth was dumped each morning. The ground there was soft, almost warm. When the hole was deep enough, they laid the mirror inside, face down. The father shoveled the dirt back over it, pressing it flat with his boot. The mother stood beside him, the mourning veil clutched in her hands. "It's done," she said. He nodded, though his eyes stayed on the soil. "Nothing stays done," he said. They went back inside. The fire had burned low again, the room smelling faintly of smoke and cold iron. The boy was half awake, pretending to sleep, his eyes following their movements. The mother hung the mourning veil back on the wall, though now it covered nothing. The fabric stirred once, then stilled. The rest of the night passed without sound. But when dawn came, the frost on the windows was different. It had spread from the bottom up, not from the cold outside, but from something within the glass itself. The patterns were long, curved and deliberate, like the marks of fingers pressing from the other side. The mother stood at the window for a long time, her hand resting lightly on the sill. "It's not finished," she whispered. The father didn't answer. He sat at the table, staring at the blackened hearth. The boy followed her gaze to the frost, to the faint, hand-like shapes reaching upward through the glass. The light behind them caught and shimmered like silver. He thought then of the mirror under the earth, its face pressed into the dirt, waiting. He thought of the mourning veil hanging empty above the cold hearth. And for the first time since the night of the whispers, he wondered if covering something had ever truly kept it from looking back. Dawn came grey and slow, the kind of light that revealed more than it warmed. It slipped through the cracks in the shutters and laid itself thinly across the floorboards, over the table, over the hearth now cold and bare. The fire had died before anyone stirred, leaving behind only a low mound of pale ash that gave no sign of heat. The air smelled of damp wood and soil, and beneath it lingered something sharper, metallic, faintly sour, like old blood or rain on rusted iron. The boy was the first to wake. He sat up on his cot and listened, unsure at first if the stillness meant peace or absence. The silence of the house had changed again. It was no longer waiting, no longer full of the tension that had pressed against the walls for nights on end. It was hollow now, tired, spent. He looked toward the window. The frost that had formed there overnight was melting, thin lines of water running slowly down the glass like tears that never fully fell. The mother was already sitting by the table, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She held the Bible open in her lap, but she wasn't reading. Her lips moved without sound, her eyes fixed on the wall opposite her, the place where the mirror had once hung. The empty veil still hung there, slightly crooked, its edges curling inward as though drawn by breath. The faint morning light made the fabric look thinner than ever. The father sat near the door, his boots still muddy from the night before, his hands folded loosely in his lap. He had not slept. His eyes were hollow and dry, and when the boy spoke his name, he didn't answer right away. "Is it over?" the boy asked. The father blinked slowly. "Over," he repeated, his voice rough. "Nothing's ever over. It just stops showing itself." The mother turned a page in the Bible, though she didn't look down. "He's right," she said. "Things don't leave. They just quiet down when they've had their fill." The eldest girl stirred near the hearth, her hair tangled, her eyes heavy with sleeplessness. "It feels lighter," she said softly. The father looked towards her. Light isn't always mercy. No one replied. The boy rose and went to the window. The frost had almost cleared now, leaving streaks of condensation that caught the pale sun. The yard outside was still, but different. The ground that had been soft for days was frozen again, hard and colourless. The fence stood straight, every lantern post empty. The fog had not returned. The world looked clean in a way that felt unnatural, as if the air itself had been scrubbed of memory. He turned to the father. "The swamp?" The father nodded once. "I'll go see." The mother reached for his arm. "Not today." "Today's the day," he said. He left before anyone could stop him. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house like something final. The mother sat still for a long while after he was gone, her hand resting on the open Bible but not turning another page. The boy watched the door, waiting for the sound of boots in the yard, but none came. When the father reached the edge of the field, the air grew colder. The frost glittered faintly beneath his steps, the ground brittle and dry. Each breath left a thin cloud that vanished too quickly. The pines stood dark and unmoving, their trunks slick with the moisture of days past. The path to the swamp was narrower than he remembered, half choked with dead grass and frost-bitten weeds. The closer he came to the water, the quieter the world became. Not a single bird called, not a single branch creaked. Even the sound of his boots faded, replaced by the faint hum that had haunted the nights before, the low, hollow vibration that had lived in the walls, in the ground, in his chest. The swamp had risen in the night. The water stretched farther now, swallowing the lower edge of the field. Thin sheets of ice floated on its surface, shifting with the faintest movement. And there, half sunken in the mud, stood something that hadn't been there before. A bell. It was small, no larger than a man's hand, its surface black with tarnish. It hung from a piece of twisted iron that jutted up from the ground, half buried in the muck. No rope hung from it, yet it swayed gently, as though stirred by a breeze that touched nothing else. The father stepped closer, the frost cracking beneath his boots. He reached out and stopped just short of it. The metal was dull, but it caught the faint light of morning in a way that made it look alive. He could see his reflection in it, distorted, faint, as though the bell were filled with water. Behind that reflection, another shape moved. He froze. The sound that followed wasn't a toll, not like before. It was a breath, a soft, drawn-out sigh that came not from the air, but from within the bell itself. The ground beneath him shifted slightly, the mud trembling like something breathing underneath. He stepped back once, twice, then stopped. The reflection in the bell changed. It wasn't his face anymore. It was hers. The woman he hadn't spoken of in years. The one buried before the war, before the house was finished, before the world had settled into its long silence. Her face was pale, her mouth neither open nor closed, her eyes fixed on him with the kind of recognition that carried no forgiveness. He tried to speak her name, but his throat wouldn't open. The sound that left him was small and broken. The bell swayed once more. No sound this time, just motion. Then the reflection was gone. When he returned to the house, his face was grey, his coat dark with moisture. The boy met him at the door. "What did you see?" he asked. The father didn't answer. He walked past him, his boots leaving wet marks across the floor. The mother rose slowly, her voice low and uncertain. "It's her, isn't it?" The father stopped at the hearth, his back to them all. "It's everything," he said. He sat down, his hands trembling as he reached toward the cold ash. "The land remembers," he said quietly. "Everything we've buried, everything we've done to keep it quiet. It doesn't forget. It just waits for the weight to sink deep enough." The mother's eyes filled, though she didn't let the tears fall. "You think it's penance," she said. He nodded slowly. "It's debt." The boy sat beside the hearth, his gaze on the ashes. They looked almost white now, lighter than they'd ever been, as though what had burned there had finally spent itself. The mother closed the Bible and set it on the mantel. The sound of the cover falling shut was soft, but it carried through the room like a bell that didn't need to ring. The eldest girl spoke from the corner. "Will it come back?" The father's voice was quiet. It never left. They stayed there through the morning, the light growing stronger, but no warmer. The fog never returned, but the smell of the swamp lingered, faint but certain. The morning veil stirred once in the still air, though no window was open. The boy watched it move, slow and deliberate, as though breathing. He thought of the mirror beneath the earth, the one they'd buried in haste. He thought of the frost that had formed from within, the hand-shaped patterns pressed against the glass. He thought of the bell, the reflection, and the face that had looked back, not with anger, but with knowledge. The mother rose and went to the door. She opened it to the pale light, to the soundless field. "It's done," she said softly. The father didn't look up. "It's never done." She stepped outside anyway. The boy followed, the cold air burning his lungs. The ground crunched beneath their feet, solid now, unyielding. The fence stood firm, each post shadowed in frost. The world looked almost clean again. Almost. In the distance, the swamp gleamed faintly, its frozen surface catching the first true light of the day. Something moved beneath it, a ripple, small but steady, as if the earth were turning over in its sleep. The mother closed her eyes. "It's quiet now," she said. The boy nodded, though he could still hear it. The faintest sound, too low for words, too soft for echo, the sound of the ground remembering. When they went back inside, the father was still sitting by the hearth. His hands were black with ash. He looked up once, meeting the boy's eyes. "Every house carries its own sin," he said. "Ours just decided to show it." He brushed his hands together, the grey dust falling to the floor in small clouds. The boy watched it settle, thought of the ashes, the bell, the frost, the face, the silence. Outside, the light continued to grow. It spread across the field, across the house, across the swamp that had taken so much and given nothing back. The world looked washed and empty, like a page wiped clean. But beneath the frozen soil, beneath the buried glass and the soft hum of earth remembering what it had swallowed, something still stirred. Not restless, not cruel, just patient. And when the first full light of day finally touched the hearth, it caught the smallest glint in the ash. A shimmer, quick and quiet, like the last breath of a dying flame that refused to go out.